Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The thing under the bed, it started with a creak. Mia had always been afraid of the dark. At 22, she thought she'd outgrown her childhood fears, but the old house she'd just moved into seemed determined to prove her wrong. The place was charming during the day, sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, the scent of aged wood filling the air, but at night it felt different, oppressive, alive. The first night she heard it, a faint creaking sound like someone shifting their weight on an old wooden floor. It came from beneath her bed. Just the house settling, she told herself, pulling the blanket up to her chin. But deep down she wasn't convinced. The creaking continued. Night after night it grew louder, more deliberate. Sometimes she swore she heard breathing, shallow, ragged breaths that seemed to rise from the shadows under her bed. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was her imagination, but the fear gnawed at her. One night she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her phone, turned on the flashlight, and peered over the edge of the bed. Nothing, just dust bunnies and an old shoebox she hadn't unpacked yet. She let out a shaky laugh, feeling silly. But as she started to pull back, something moved. A hand, pale and skeletal, its fingers curled around the edge of the bed frame. Mia screamed, scrambling backward as the hand tightened its grip, the knuckles cracking like dry twigs. She fell off the bed, her phone skittering across the floor, its light casting wild shadows on the walls. The creaking grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was under the bed was trying to climb out. Mia grabbed her phone and ran, slamming the bedroom door behind her. She spent the rest of the night on the couch, clutching a kitchen knife, her heart racing. The next morning, she convinced herself it had been a nightmare. She hadn't slept well in days after all. But when she returned to her room, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The shoebox was gone. She searched the room, her panic growing with each passing second. It wasn't under the bed, in the closet, or anywhere else. It had simply vanished. That night, the creaking returned. This time it was accompanied by a new sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping like fingernails drumming against wood. Mia lay frozen in bed, her eyes glued to the ceiling, too terrified to move. Then she felt it. A cold, bony hand wrapped around her ankle. She screamed, kicking wildly, but the grip only tightened. The hand yanked her toward the edge of the bed, her fingers clawing at the sheets as she tried to pull herself free. She twisted her body, shining her phone's flashlight under the bed, and what she saw would haunt her forever. A face, pale and gaunt, its hollow eyes stared up at her, a grotesque smile stretching across its features. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth, and it spoke in a voice that sounded like nails on a chalkboard. "You found me." Mia kicked with all her strength, breaking free and tumbling to the floor. She scrambled to her feet and ran, not stopping until she was outside, the cold night air biting at her skin. She never went back. The house was abandoned, left to rot with whatever lurked beneath its floors. But if you ever find yourself in an old creaky house and you hear a sound coming from under your bed, don't look, because something might be looking back. The whispering walls, it began with a whisper. Emma had just moved into the old Victorian house on the edge of town. The realtor had called it a fixer-upper, but to her it was perfect. The high ceilings, the creaking wooden floors, the ivy crawling up the brick exterior. It felt like a dream. But dreams, as she would soon learn, can quickly turn into nightmares. The first night she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. She dismissed it as her imagination, the house settling, or perhaps the pipes groaning. But the next night it was louder. Emma, her name. Someone or something had whispered her name. She froze, her heart pounding. The voice was soft, almost melodic, but it sent a shiver down her spine. She searched the house, room by room, but found nothing. No intruders, no open windows, nothing. The whispers continued. Night after night they grew clearer, more insistent. "Emma, stay with us." She tried to ignore them, burying herself in work during the day and sleeping with the lights on at night. But the house had other plans. One evening, as she was painting the living room walls, she noticed something strange. Beneath the layers of old wallpaper, faint words began to appear. They weren't written in ink or paint, but seemed to emerge from the walls themselves, as if the house were alive. "Help us." Emma stumbled back, her paintbrush clattering to the floor. She tore at the wallpaper, revealing more words, more pleas. "We're trapped. Set us free. Join us." Her hands trembled as she called the realtor, demanding answers. The woman hesitated before finally relenting. "The house, it has a history," she said. "The previous owners disappeared. No one knows what happened to them. Some say they're still there in the walls." Emma hung up, her mind racing. She couldn't stay here. She had to leave. But as she packed her bags, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Don't go. Stay with us. Forever." The lights flickered, and the air grew cold. Shadows danced on the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes. Emma grabbed her suitcase and ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. She pulled and pulled, but it was as if the house itself was holding her captive. The whispers became screams, echoing in her ears. She turned to see the walls cracking, splintering, as if something was trying to break through. And then she saw them. Faces, pale and gaunt, pressing against the plaster, their hollow eyes staring into hers. "Join us," she screamed, but no sound came out. The walls closed in, the faces drawing closer, their cold hands reaching for her. When the police arrived, the next day responding to a neighbor's call about strange noises, they found the house empty. Emma was gone, her suitcase still by the door. But if you listen closely, on quiet nights, you can still hear the whispers. "Stay with us. Forever." And if you're unlucky enough to step inside, you might just see the faces in the walls, waiting for their next victim. The Iron Hollow. The town of Black Hollow was a forgotten place, nestled deep in a valley surrounded by jagged mountains. Its people were simple, hard-working folk who kept to themselves and avoided the old iron mine at the edge of town. The mine had been abandoned for decades, its entrance sealed with rusted gates and warnings that no one dared to ignore. But when a group of teenagers decided to break in on a dare, they awakened something that should have stayed buried. The dare, it was a cold October night when Jake, the self-proclaimed leader of the group, suggested they explore the mine. "Come on," he said, his breath visible in the frosty air. "Everyone says it's haunted. Let's see for ourselves." The others hesitated. There were stories about the mine, whispers of accidents, disappearances, and something worse, but Jake was persuasive, and peer pressure was a powerful thing. They broke the lock on the gate and ventured inside, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The air was thick with the smell of rust and decay, and the walls seemed to close in around them as they descended deeper into the earth. That's when they heard it. A low, metallic groan like the sound of grinding gears. It echoed through the tunnels, sending chills down their spines. "What the hell was that?" whispered Mia, her voice trembling. "Probably just the wind," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. They pressed on, their bravado fading with every step. The tunnels twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the mine. And then they found it. A massive chamber, its walls lined with strange, rusted machinery. In the center of the room was a pit, its edges jagged and uneven. The air here was colder, heavier, and the metallic groaning was louder. "Let's get out of here," Mia said, her voice barely above a whisper. But Jake wasn't listening. He was staring at the pit, his flashlight illuminating something glinting in the darkness. "Look at this," he said, stepping closer. The others followed, their curiosity overcoming their fear. At the bottom of the pit was a massive humanoid figure made entirely of metal. Its body was a patchwork of rusted iron, its limbs twisted and jagged. Its face was a grotesque mask with hollow eyes and a mouth frozen in a silent scream. "What is that thing?" asked Tom, his voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The metallic groaning grew louder, more frantic, and the figure in the pit began to move. Its head snapped up, its hollow eyes glowing with a faint, sickly light. Its limbs creaked and groaned as it pulled itself out of the pit, its massive form towering over the group. "Run!" Jake shouted. They didn't need to be told twice. The awakening, the thing, whatever it was, chased them through the tunnels, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground. It moved with unnatural speed, its metal limbs screeching as it closed the distance. One by one, the group fell behind. Tom was the first to go. He tripped over a loose rock, and before he could get up, the metal monster was on him. Its jagged hands tore through his flesh like paper, and his screams echoed through the tunnels before being abruptly silenced. Mia and Jake kept running, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they tried to find their way back to the surface. But the tunnels seemed to shift and change, as if the mine itself was alive and working against them. They eventually found the entrance, but the monster was right behind them. Mia made it out, but Jake wasn't so lucky. The thing grabbed him by the leg, dragging him back into the darkness. His screams were the last thing Mia heard before she collapsed on the ground outside, gasping for air. The hunt. Mia told the police everything, but no one believed her. They searched the mine and found no trace of Jake, Tom, or the metal monster. The case was closed, and the town tried to forget. But the monster didn't forget. It began to emerge at night, its massive form silhouetted against the moon as it stalked the streets of Black Hollow. People started disappearing. First one, then two, then more. The town was gripped by fear, but no one dared to speak of the thing that haunted them. Mia knew she had to stop it. She spent weeks researching the mine, uncovering its dark history. The mine had been a testing ground for an experimental machine, a weapon designed to harness the power of the earth itself. But something had gone wrong, and the machine had become sentient, feeding on the lives of those who came too close. Armed with this knowledge, Mia returned to the mine. She found the chamber where the monster had been born, and set a trap, using the remnants of the machinery to create an electromagnetic pulse. The monster found her, its hollow eyes glowing with rage as it lunged. But Mia activated the pulse, and the thing let out a deafening scream as its body began to collapse in on itself. When the dust settled, the monster was gone. The aftermath. The town of Black Hollow was never the same. The disappearances stopped, but the scars remained. Mia left soon after, unable to shake the feeling that the monster was still out there, waiting, and maybe it was. Because deep in the mine, in the darkest corner of the chamber, a single rusted hand twitched. The end. Or is it? The Hawk Tuger girl in the small, isolated village of Blackthorn, nestled deep in the forest. There was a legend about a girl who could summon hawks. They called her the Hawk Tuger girl. The story went like this. Centuries ago, a young girl named Tuger was accused of witchcraft after a series of strange events in the village. Crops withered, livestock died, and children went missing. The villagers blamed Tuger, claiming she had made a pact with the forest spirits. In a fit of rage, they tied her to a tree and left her to die. But Tuger didn't die. As the villagers watched, a flock of hawks descended from the sky, their talons sharp and their eyes glowing like embers. They tore through the ropes binding Tuger, and carried her away into the forest. Before she disappeared, she turned to the villagers and whispered, "I will return." No one ever saw her again, but the legend lived on, passed down through generations as a warning. The disappearances centuries later. The village of Blackthorn was a quiet, forgotten place. The forest loomed around it like a living thing, its shadows stretching longer with each passing year. The villagers kept to themselves, wary of outsiders and the secrets the forest held. But then the disappearances began. First it was a child who wandered too far into the woods, then a hunter who went out at dawn and never returned. The villagers searched for days but found no trace of them. The only clue was the sound of hawks screeching in the distance, their cries echoing through the trees like a warning. The elders whispered about the legend of the Hawk Tuger girl, but no one dared to say her name aloud. The stranger. One evening, a young woman arrived in the village. She was pale and thin, with dark hair that fell in tangled waves around her face. Her eyes were a piercing green, and she carried a strange feathered staff. "My name is Tuger," she said, her voice soft but commanding. "I've come to help." The villagers were wary, but they were desperate. They told her about the disappearances, and she listened intently, her expression unreadable. "I'll find them," she said, "but you must stay out of the forest. No matter what you hear, do not follow me." That night, Tuger disappeared into the woods. The villagers waited, their fear growing with each passing hour. Then just before dawn they heard it, a chorus of hawk cries, louder and more frantic than ever before. The truth. The next morning, Tuger returned. She was covered in blood, her clothes torn and her face pale. In her hand, she held a small feathered talisman. "I found them," she said, her voice hollow, "but it's too late. The forest has claimed them." The villagers demanded answers, but Tuger refused to say more. She left the talisman on the ground and walked away, disappearing into the forest once more. That night, the villagers heard the hawks again. This time the cries were closer, almost as if they were circling the village. The air grew cold, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. The house on Hollow Hill. The house on Hollow Hill had stood abandoned for over 50 years. Its windows were shattered, its roof sagged under the weight of time, and its walls were covered in ivy that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The locals called it the widow's house, and they avoided it like the plague. But when Sarah and her husband Mark moved to the small town of Blackwood, they saw the house as an opportunity. It was cheap, secluded, and had the potential to be their dream home. They should have listened to the warnings. The move-in. The first few days were uneventful. Sarah and Mark spent their time cleaning and repairing the house, their laughter echoing through the empty halls. But as the sun set on the third day, things began to change. Sarah was unpacking boxes in the attic when she heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping like someone knocking on wood. She froze, her heart pounding as she scanned the room. "Mark," she called, her voice trembling. No answer. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and Sarah realized it was coming from the far corner of the attic. She grabbed a flashlight and approached slowly, her breath shallow. In the corner was an old dusty rocking chair. It was moving back and forth, creaking softly, as if someone invisible was sitting in it. Sarah screamed and ran downstairs, nearly colliding with Mark in the hallway. "There's something in the attic," she gasped. Mark laughed it off, chalking it up to the house settling. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The shadows. The next night, Sarah woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. She nudged Mark, but he was fast asleep. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside their bedroom door. The doorknob began to turn. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the door creaked open. The hallway was pitch black, but she could feel a presence standing there just beyond the threshold. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The door slammed shut, and the room grew cold. Sarah pulled the blankets over her head, her heart racing, and didn't sleep the rest of the night. The history. The next day, Sarah visited the local library, determined to uncover the house's history. The librarian, an elderly woman with a knowing look, handed her a dusty old book. "The Widow's House," the librarian said. "It's a tragic story." Sarah flipped through the pages, her stomach churning as she read. The house had been built in the 1800s by a wealthy widower named Elias Holloway. He lived there with his young daughter Clara, until one fateful night when Clara disappeared. Elias searched for her for weeks, but she was never found. Heartbroken, Elias hanged himself in the attic. But that wasn't the end of the story. Over the years, several families had moved into the house, only to flee within months. They reported strange occurrences, footsteps, whispers, and the sound of a child crying. Some even claimed to see a shadowy figure standing in the attic window, watching them. Sarah closed the book, her hands trembling. The possession. That night, the house came alive. Sarah and Mark were woken by the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the halls. The air grew cold, and the walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy. "Mark, we need to leave," Sarah said, her voice shaking, but Mark didn't respond. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to her, his shoulders hunched. "Mark," he turned slowly, and Sarah's blood ran cold. His eyes were black, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. "Clara wants to play," he said, his voice low and guttural. Sarah screamed as Mark lunged at her, his hands clawing at her throat. She fought back, her mind racing as she tried to remember what she'd read in the book. The attic, she thought. She broke free and ran upstairs, Mark close behind. The attic door was open, the rocking chair moving back and forth as if waiting for her. Sarah grabbed the chair and smashed it against the wall, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small weathered doll, the same doll Clara had been holding in a photo in the library book. Mark stopped in his tracks, his body convulsing as a dark shadow emerged from him and dissipated into the air. The aftermath. Sarah and Mark left the house that night, never to return. The doll was buried in the town cemetery, and the house on Hollow Hill was sealed shut. But the story doesn't end there. If you drive past the house on a quiet night, you might see a shadowy figure standing in the attic window watching, and if you listen closely, you might hear the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the trees. The widow's house is still waiting for its next victim, the toy maker's curse. In the small, foggy town of Ravenswood, there was a legend about a toy maker named Elias Finch. He was a reclusive man, known for crafting the most beautiful and lifelike toys anyone had ever seen. But there was something unsettling about his creations, something almost too real. Parents whispered that Elias had made a deal with dark forces to bring his toys to life. They said his workshop was filled with strange symbols and eerie chants, and that the toys he made were more than just wood and paint. When Elias died under mysterious circumstances, his workshop was sealed shut, and his toys were buried with him. But not all of them stayed buried. The find Emily was a single mother struggling to make ends meet. When she and her 6-year-old son, Liam, moved into a small rundown house on the edge of Ravenswood, she hoped it would be a fresh start. One rainy afternoon, while exploring the attic, Liam found a dusty old toy box. Inside was a hand-carved wooden doll, its paint chipped but its face eerily lifelike. It had wide, glassy eyes and a faint smile that seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. "Look, Mom, his name is Charlie," Liam said, pointing to the name carved into the doll's chest. Emily felt a chill run down her spine, but she didn't have the heart to take the toy away. Liam had been through so much already, and he seemed so happy. That night she heard Liam talking in his room. "Who are you talking to, sweetie?" she asked, peeking through the door. "Charlie," Liam said, holding up the doll. "He says he's my friend." Emily forced a smile, but the doll's glassy eyes seemed to stare right through her. The changes. At first, everything seemed fine. Liam was happier than he'd been in months, and Emily was grateful for the distraction. But then, strange things started happening. Liam began sleepwalking, wandering into the attic in the middle of the night. When Emily found him, he was sitting in the corner, whispering to the doll. "Liam, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Charlie says we have to play," Liam replied, his voice flat and distant. Emily took the doll and locked it in a cabinet, but the next morning it was back in Liam's room. The nightmares started soon after. Liam would wake up screaming, claiming that Charlie was standing at the foot of his bed watching him. Emily would rush in to find the doll sitting on the floor, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The truth desperate for answers, Emily visited the town's library. The librarian, an elderly woman with a knowing look, handed her a dusty old book. "The Toymaker's Curse," the librarian said. "Elias Finch's toys were never just toys, they were vessels." Emily flipped through the pages, her stomach churning as she read. Elias had used dark rituals to bind the souls of the dead to his creations. The toys were meant to bring joy, but they were cursed, feeding on the energy of the owners. Over the years, several children had gone missing, their bodies never found. The last page of the book contained a warning: destroy the toy before it destroys you. The final night, Emily raced home, her heart pounding. She found Liam in his room, sitting on the floor, with the doll in his lap. His eyes were glazed over, and he was muttering something under his breath. "Liam," she shouted, grabbing the doll, but Liam clung to it, his grip unnaturally strong. "Charlie says we have to stay together," he said, his voice low and guttural. Emily pried the doll from his hands and ran to the fireplace. She threw it into the flames, watching as the wood cracked and splintered. The doll let out a high-pitched scream, its glassy eyes glowing with a sickly light. The flames turned black, and the room grew cold. Liam collapsed to the floor, unconscious but alive. The aftermath. The next morning, the doll was gone, reduced to ashes. Liam had no memory of what had happened, and Emily never spoke of it again. But sometimes, late at night, she would hear a faint tapping at the window, and when she looked outside, she would see a small shadowy figure standing in the yard, its glassy eyes glowing in the darkness. The Toymaker's curse was never truly broken. The Carnival of Shadows. The Carnival of Shadows came to the town of Black Hollow without warning. One day the field on the edge of town was empty. The next it was filled with flickering lights, creaking rides, and the faint sound of calliope music drifting through the air. The townsfolk were wary. No one had seen the carnival arrive, and no one knew where it had come from. But the bright lights and promises of wonder were too tempting to resist. By nightfall, the carnival was packed. The arrival Maggie and her younger brother Tommy were among the first to arrive. Maggie was skeptical. She hated crowds and loud noises, but Tommy had begged her to take him. The carnival was unlike anything they'd ever seen. The rides were old and rusted, their gears grinding loudly as they spun. The games were manned by silent, pale-faced workers who never smiled, and the air smelled faintly of burnt sugar and something else, something metallic like blood. "Come on, Maggie, let's try the Ferris wheel," Tommy said, tugging on her hand. Maggie hesitated. The Ferris wheel loomed over the carnival, its lights flickering ominously. but Tommy's excitement was infectious, and she reluctantly agreed. As they climbed into the rickety gondola, Maggie noticed something strange. The carnival workers were all watching them, their eyes dark and unblinking. The ride began with a jolt, and Maggie gripped the safety bar tightly. As they rose higher, the carnival below seemed to change. The lights grew dimmer, the music slower, and the laughter of the crowd turned into faint, echoing whispers. "Tommy, do you see that?" Maggie asked, her voice trembling, but Tommy wasn't listening. He was staring at something in the distance, his face pale. "Maggie, look," he whispered, pointing toward the edge of the carnival. Maggie followed his gaze and froze. The field beyond the carnival was no longer empty. It was filled with rows of crumbling tombstones, their inscriptions glowing faintly in the moonlight. The games. When the ride ended, Maggie tried to convince Tommy to leave, but he was determined to stay. "Just one more game, please," he begged. Maggie reluctantly agreed, hoping to keep him close. They approached a booth where a man in a tattered top hat stood behind a counter. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, and his smile stretched too wide. "Step right up," he called, his voice raspy. "Win a prize and you'll never forget it." Tommy handed over a crumpled dollar bill and picked up a small wooden mallet. The game was simple. Hit the target, and the bell would ring. Tommy swung the mallet, and the bell rang, but the sound was wrong. It was deep and guttural, like a groan. The man in the top hat leaned forward, his grin widening. "Congratulations, boy. You've won a prize." He handed Tommy a small black box. Inside was a porcelain doll, its face painted with a sinister smile. "Tommy, put that back," Maggie said, her voice sharp, but Tommy clutched the doll to his chest. "No, it's mine." The curse that night. Maggie woke to the sound of Tommy whispering in his room. She crept down the hall and peeked through the door. Tommy was sitting on the floor, the doll in his lap. His eyes were glazed over, and he was muttering something under his breath. "Tommy," Maggie whispered. He turned to her, his face pale and expressionless. "Charlie says we have to play." Maggie's blood ran cold. She grabbed the doll and threw it out the window. But the next morning, it was back in Tommy's room. Over the next few days, Tommy changed. He became withdrawn, his skin pale, and his eyes hollow. He stopped eating and spent hours locked in his room, whispering to the doll. Maggie tried everything to break the curse, burning the doll, burying it, even taking it to the church, but nothing worked. The carnival's return one night. Maggie woke to the sound of calliope music drifting through the air. She looked out the window and saw the carnival's lights flickering in the distance. Tommy was gone. Maggie ran to the carnival, her heart pounding. The field was empty, except for the Ferris wheel, its lights flickering faintly. At the base of the ride stood the man in the top hat, holding Tommy's hand. "Let him go," Maggie screamed. The man turned to her, his grin stretching wider. "He's ours now," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. Maggie lunged at him, but he vanished into thin air. The Ferris wheel began to spin, its gears grinding loudly. Maggie climbed onto the ride, her hands slipping on the rusted metal. As she reached the top, she saw Tommy sitting in one of the gondolas, the doll in his lap. "Tommy," she screamed, reaching for him, but the gondola was empty. Tommy and the doll were gone. The aftermath. The carnival disappeared the next morning, leaving no trace of its existence. Maggie searched for weeks, but Tommy was never found. The townsfolk claimed the Carnival of Shadows was a legend, a ghost story meant to scare children, but Maggie knew the truth. Sometimes late at night, she would hear the faint sound of calliope music drifting through the air, and when she looked out the window, she would see the carnival's lights flickering in the distance, beckoning her to return. But Maggie never went back. The mirror of echoes. In the quiet, fog-shrouded town of Blackwater, there was an antique shop tucked away on a cobblestone street. The shop was called Eldritch Relics, and it was known for its strange and unsettling items. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Grayson, was rumored to have a collection of cursed objects that carried with them a dark and terrible history. Among these objects was a mirror. It was an ornate, full-length mirror, with a gilded frame, carved with intricate twisting patterns. Its surface was flawless, reflecting everything with a clarity that was almost unnatural. But there was something about the mirror that made people uneasy. Some claimed it whispered to them, others said it showed them things that weren't there. When Claire, a young artist struggling with creative block, stumbled into the shop one rainy afternoon, She was immediately drawn to the mirror. The purchase Claire had been searching for inspiration. Her art had grown stale, and she was desperate for something, anything to reignite her passion. When she saw the mirror, she felt an inexplicable pull, as if it were calling to her. "How much for the mirror?" she asked Mr. Grayson. The old man hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "That mirror, it's not for everyone," he said slowly. "I'll take it," Claire said, ignoring the warning in his voice. Mr. Grayson sighed and named a price. As he wrapped the mirror in brown paper, he leaned closer and whispered, "Be careful what you see in it." Claire laughed it off, but as she carried the mirror to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her. The reflection, the mirror, looked stunning in Claire's studio. Its gilded frame added a touch of elegance to the otherwise cluttered space, and its surface seemed to glow in the dim light. At first everything was fine. Claire painted for hours, her creativity flowing like never before. But then, late one night, she noticed something strange. She was standing in front of the mirror, brushing her hair. When she saw a movement in the reflection, it was subtle, just a flicker in the corner of the room, but it was enough to make her freeze. She turned around, but the room was empty. Shaking off the unease, she went to bed. But the next night, it happened again. This time the movement was clearer. In the reflection, she saw a figure standing behind her, a tall, shadowy figure, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. Claire spun around, her heart pounding, but the room was still empty. The whisper, the figure began to appear more frequently, always in the reflection, but never. Claire tried covering the mirror with a sheet, but every morning, the sheet would be on the floor, the mirror uncovered. One night, as she stood in front of the mirror, she heard it, a faint, raspy whisper. Claire, her blood ran cold. The voice was coming from the mirror. She stepped closer, her reflection staring back at her, but something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't moving in sync with her. It was smiling, a cruel, twisted smile that sent chills down her spine. "Who are you?" Claire whispered. The reflection tilted its head, its eyes glowing faintly. "I am you," it said, its voice echoing unnaturally. Claire stumbled back, tripping over her easel and falling to the floor. When she looked up, the reflection was gone, and the mirror was once again just a mirror. The truth desperate for answers, Claire returned to Eldritch Relics. Mr. Grayson was waiting for her, as if he'd known she would come. "The mirror," she said, her voice trembling. "What is it?" Mr. Grayson sighed and gestured for her to sit. "That mirror is cursed," he said. "It was created by a sorcerer centuries ago, a man who sought to trap the souls of his enemies. But the mirror became a prison for his own soul when he was betrayed. It feeds on the living, drawing them in until they become part of its reflection." Claire's heart sank. "How do I stop it?" Mr. Grayson shook his head. "Once the mirror has chosen you, there's no escape. It will consume you, just as it has consumed so many others." The final night, Claire refused to accept her fate. That night, she stood in front of the mirror, a hammer. "I won't let you take me," she said, her voice shaking. The reflection laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the room. "You already have," it said. Claire swung the hammer, shattering the mirror into 1,000 pieces, but as the glass fell to the floor, she realized her mistake. The room around her began to dissolve, the walls crumbling into darkness. She looked down and saw that her hands were fading, becoming transparent. The mirror hadn't been destroyed, it had absorbed her. The aftermath. The next morning, Claire's studio was empty. The mirror was gone, and there was no trace of her. But if you visit Eldritch Relics, you might see the mirror in the corner of the shop, its surface flawless and its frame gleaming. And if you look closely, you might see Claire's reflection staring back at you, her eyes wide with terror. The mirror is always hungry. The last outpost. The world ended not with a bang, but with a bite. It started with a virus, a mysterious, fast-spreading pathogen that turned people into ravenous, flesh-eating monsters. Within weeks, cities fell, governments collapsed, and humanity was pushed to the brink of extinction. In the midst of the chaos, a small group of survivors found refuge in an abandoned military outpost deep in the mountains. They called it Fort Hope, and for a while it lived up to its name. But hope is a fragile thing. The arrival. The group was led by Captain Marcus Hale, a hardened soldier who had seen too much death to believe in miracles. With him were Dr. Elena Reyes, a virologist desperately searching for a cure, Jake, a mechanic with a knack for fixing anything, Lila, a former teacher turned sharpshooter, and Sam, a teenager who had lost everything but refused to give up. They had been at Fort Hope for 3 months, surviving on scavenged supplies and the occasional hunt. The outpost was surrounded by high walls and barbed wire, but the zombies were relentless. Every night they clawed at the barriers, their guttural moans echoing through the mountains. "We can't stay here forever," Elena said one evening as the group sat around a flickering fire. "The walls won't hold forever, and we're running out of supplies." Marcus nodded, his face grim. "We'll leave in a week, head north, find a safer place." But fate had other plans. The breach, the attack came at dawn. The zombies had been gathering in the woods for days, their numbers growing with each passing hour. When they finally surged forward, it was like a tidal wave of rotting flesh and gnashing teeth. "To the walls," Marcus shouted, grabbing his rifle. The group scrambled to their positions, firing into the horde as it crashed against the barriers. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire, screams, and the sickening crunch of bone. But it wasn't enough. The zombies overwhelmed the outer defenses, tearing through the barbed wire and scaling the walls. Marcus and the others retreated to the main building, barricading themselves inside as the undead poured into the compound. "We need to get to the armory," Marcus said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "If we can hold them off long enough, we might be able to escape." The escape. The group moved through the building, their footsteps echoing in the narrow hallways. The zombies were everywhere, their guttural moans growing louder with every step. They reached the armory, but the door was jammed. "Jake, get it open," Marcus barked. Jake fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking. "I'm trying." The zombies were closing in, their rotting hands clawing at the walls. Lila fired her rifle, taking down one after another, but there were too many. Finally, the door creaked open, and the group rushed inside. The armory was stocked with weapons and ammunition, but it was also a dead end. "We're trapped," Sam said, his voice trembling. Marcus shook his head. "There's another way out. Follow me." He led them to a hidden hatch in the floor, revealing a narrow tunnel that led outside the compound. "Go," Marcus shouted, shoving the others toward the tunnel. "What about you?" Elena asked, her eyes wide with fear. "I'll hold them off," Marcus said, his voice firm. "Now go." The sacrifice. The group crawled through the tunnel, the sound of gunfire and screams fading behind them. When they emerged, they were outside the walls, the forest stretching out before them, but Marcus was gone. They didn't have time to mourn. The zombies were still coming, their guttural moans growing louder as they closed in. "Run," Elena shouted, grabbing Sam's hand. They sprinted through the woods, the zombies hot on their heels. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches clawing at their faces as they ran. The safe zone. Hours later, they stumbled into a clearing. In the distance, they saw a fortified settlement, a safe zone surrounded by high walls and armed guards. "We made it," Jake said, his voice hoarse, but as they approached the gates, they realized the truth. The safe zone was overrun, its walls breached and its streets filled with the undead. "There's nowhere left to go," Lila said, her voice hollow. Elena shook her head. "We keep moving. We survive." That's what Marcus would have wanted. The aftermath. The group continued their journey, fighting for every mile. They scavenged for supplies, avoided the hordes, and searched for a place where they could start over. But the zombies were always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next meal. The world had ended, but the fight for survival was far from over. The Whispering Woods on the outskirts of the small town of Black Hollow. There was a forest known as the Whispering Woods. The locals avoided it, claiming it was cursed. They said the trees whispered to those who ventured too close, luring them deeper into the shadows until they were never seen again. But when a group of friends decided to camp in the woods for a weekend getaway, they didn't believe the stories. They should have listened. The arrival. The group consisted of 5 friends: Emma, the adventurous leader; Jake, the skeptic; Mia, the artist; Ryan, the joker; and Sarah, the quiet one. They arrived at the edge of the woods just as the sun was setting, the trees casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Relax," Emma said, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. "It's just a bunch of trees. What's the worst that could happen?" As they ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, and the light faded quickly. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. "Did you hear that?" Mia asked, stopping suddenly. The group fell silent, listening. At first there was nothing, then faintly, they heard it, a soft rhythmic whispering, like voices carried on the wind. "It's just the wind," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. They set up camp in a small clearing, the whispering growing louder as the night wore on. The first night was uneventful, but the whispering never stopped. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a constant, unsettling presence. The next morning, Ryan was gone. His tent was empty, his sleeping bag still warm. The group searched the area, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. "Maybe he went for a walk," Emma said, though her voice trembled. But as the day went on, Ryan didn't return. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and the trees seemed to close in around them. The voices. That night, the group huddled around the campfire, their nerves frayed. The whispering was louder now, the voices clearer. "Do you hear that?" Mia asked, her eyes wide with fear. The others nodded, their faces pale. The voices were speaking in a language they didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice shaking. But before anyone could respond, the fire went out, plunging them into darkness. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, and the trees began to creak and groan, as if they were alive. "Run," Emma shouted. The group scattered, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they ran. But the woods seemed to shift and change, the paths twisting and turning until they were hopelessly lost. The clearing. Mia was the first to find the clearing. It was small and circular, with a single gnarled tree in the center. The whispering stopped, and the air grew still. In the center of the clearing was Ryan. He was standing with his back to her, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Ryan," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. He turned slowly, and Mia's blood ran cold. His eyes were black, his face pale and gaunt. His mouth moved, but the voice that came out wasn't his. It was a chorus of whispers echoing through the clearing. "Join us," he said, his voice hollow and distant. Mia screamed and ran, but the trees seemed to close in around her, their branches reaching out like claws. The escape. Emma and Jake found Mia hours later, curled up in a ball and muttering to herself. Ryan was nowhere to be found. "We need to get out of here," Emma said, her voice firm despite her fear. They stumbled through the woods, the whispering growing louder. With every step, the trees seemed to shift and change, the paths twisting and turning until they finally emerged at the edge of the woods. The sun was rising, casting a pale light over the trees. The whispering stopped, and the air grew still. The aftermath. The group never spoke of what happened in the whispering woods. Ryan was never found, and the locals warned them never to return. But sometimes, late at night, they would hear the whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, but there. And when they looked out the window, they would see the trees swaying in the wind, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The whisper, "We're always waiting." Person, the next victim, and I can't stop myself from picking it up. The portrait of Blackthorn Manor. The painting arrived at the auction house on a cold, rainy afternoon, wrapped in a tattered cloth and smelling faintly of mildew. It was an old portrait, the kind you'd expect to find in the dusty halls of a forgotten mansion. The subject was a woman, her face pale and hauntingly beautiful, her eyes dark and piercing. She wore a flowing black dress, and behind her the faint outline of a grand manor loomed in the background. The painting was unsigned, and the auction house had no record of its provenance, but there was something about it that drew people in, including me. I was an art restorer, and the auction house had hired me to clean and repair the painting before it went up for sale. At first I was excited. The painting was clearly old, and if I could uncover its secrets, it might be worth a fortune. But as I began to work on it, I noticed something strange. The first thing I noticed was the eyes. They seemed to follow me no matter where I stood in the room. It was unnerving, but I told myself it was just a trick of the light. Then there were the details. Small things that seemed to change when I wasn't looking. The woman's expression would shift from serene to sinister, her lips curling into a faint smile one moment and a sneer the next. The manor in the background seemed to grow darker, more foreboding, its windows glowing faintly as if lit from within. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but the changes became harder to ignore. One morning I arrived at the studio to find the painting had shifted overnight. The woman's hand, which had been resting at her side, was now raised, her finger pointing toward the manor. And the manor itself, it looked different, as if it had aged decades in a single night. The walls were cracked and crumbling, the windows shattered, and the once grand structure now looked like a ruin. I decided to do some research, hoping to uncover the painting's history. What I found only deepened the mystery. The manor in the painting was real. Blackthorn Manor, a crumbling estate on the outskirts of town. It had been abandoned for over a century, its owners vanishing under mysterious circumstances. Local legends spoke of a curse of a woman who had lived there, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her cruelty. They said she had made a deal with something dark, something that had taken her soul and left her trapped in the manor, her spirit bound to the land. I tried to dismiss the stories as superstition, but the painting had other plans. That night I had the first dream. I was standing in front of the manor, the woman from the painting standing beside me. She didn't speak, but her eyes bore into mine, filled with a hunger that made my skin crawl. She took my hand and led me inside, the air growing colder with every step. The halls were lined with portraits, each one more grotesque than the last, faces twisted in agony, eyes wide with terror, and at the end of the hall a mirror. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't me. It was her. I woke up screaming, the painting looming over me, the woman's eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The next morning I decided to visit Blackthorn Manor. I told myself it was for research, but deep down I knew it was something else. The manor called to me, its pull impossible to resist. The drive was long, the road winding through dense woods that seemed to close in around me. When I finally arrived, the manor was exactly as it appeared in the painting, crumbling and desolate, its windows like empty eye sockets staring out at the world. I stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of decay. The halls were lined with portraits, just like in my dream, their eyes following me as I walked. And at the end of the hall, the mirror. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't me. It was her. I tried to run, but the walls seemed to close in around me, the portraits whispering my name. The woman appeared beside me, her hand cold as ice as she took mine. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice echoing in my mind. "But now that you're here, you'll never leave." I don't know how I escaped. The next thing I remember, I was back in the studio, the painting sitting on the easel, the woman's eyes glowing faintly. I tried to destroy it, to burn it, but the flames wouldn't touch it. I tried to throw it away, but it always came back. And now every night, I dream of the manor, of the woman, of the mirror. I can feel her crawling into my mind, wrapping herself around my soul. She's waiting for me, waiting to take me back. And I know, sooner or later, I won't be able to resist. This story can be expanded further with more details about the woman's backstory, the curse of Blackthorn Manor, or the experiences of previous owners of the painting. Let me know if you'd like me to delve deeper into any specific aspect. Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I never thought anything truly terrifying would happen to me. Horror stories were something I enjoyed in books and movies, not in my actual life. But that changed when I moved into my new apartment in 2017. It was a small studio in an old building, the kind that creaks in the night and has questionable plumbing. I didn't mind. It was cheap, close to work, and most importantly mine. But from the very first night, I felt something was off. The feeling wasn't immediate dread, just an occasional sensation that I wasn't alone. At first I chalked it up to paranoia, a side effect of living alone for the first time. The building made noises, old wood shifting, pipes groaning, but there was one sound that stood out from the rest. At night, I would hear faint rustling coming from the vents. I assumed it was rats. That was bad, but not terrifying. I told the landlord, who waved it off, saying, "It's an old place, you'll get used to it." So I did my best to ignore it. A few nights later, I woke up feeling watched. My studio was dark, except for the streetlights seeping through the curtains. My heart pounded as I scanned the room, but everything was as it should be. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate exhale, coming from the vent. I sat up in bed, staring at the metal grate. My breath caught in my throat. Was it my imagination? The wind? I tried to tell myself anything that would make sense, but as I strained to listen, I heard it again. A breath, slow and controlled, like someone was trying not to be heard. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I unscrewed the vent cover. My hands trembled as I peered inside. It was dark and smelled faintly of mildew and rust. I used my phone flashlight but could only see metal tunnels stretching into the shadows. There was nothing immediately there. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I convinced myself of that, until a few nights later, I had just turned off the lights when I heard it. scraping, a slow, dragging movement. My blood ran cold. I turned my head toward the vent, heart hammering. Then, a whisper. It was so faint I almost doubted it, but then it came again, a raspy voice, just barely audible. I see you. I flew out of bed and bolted out of my apartment, shaking so hard I could barely unlock my phone to call the police. When they arrived, they checked the vents in my apartment thoroughly, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone being there. I was losing my mind, I thought. Then, 2 days later, my downstairs neighbor knocked on my door. She was pale, her hands gripping the door frame tightly. "Did you hear anything weird last night?" she asked. I hesitated before answering. "Why?" She looked over her shoulder nervously, then whispered, "I swear I heard someone crawling inside the walls." My stomach dropped. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, staring at the vent, waiting for something to happen. At around 3 a.m., I heard it again, movement, and this time I wasn't going to ignore it. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it directly into the vent. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, but then something moved. Eyes, wide, bloodshot eyes staring right back at me from inside the vent. I screamed and fell back, scrambling toward the door. The eyes vanished, followed by rapid scraping noises, as if whoever or whatever was retreating. I ran to my landlord's unit, banging on his door until he opened up. I told him everything. He looked at me with an unreadable expression before sighing and rubbing his temples. "Call the cops," he muttered, grabbing his coat. Now, the police arrived quickly this time. When they removed the vent cover and shone their lights inside, they found something I still have nightmares about. A man, a gaunt, filthy man, had been living inside the ventilation system. They pulled him out, kicking and screaming, his nails broken and fingertips bloody from crawling through the metal ducts. His clothes were shredded, his hair matted. He had been living there for who knows how long, sneaking into apartments when people weren't home, watching through the grates at night. They found a small hole behind one of the old cabinets in my kitchen that led into a narrow maintenance passage connecting the vents to the basement. He had made a nest there, along with a collection of stolen items from various apartments. The police arrested him, and I moved out immediately. I still can't sleep without checking every vent in any place I live, because now, I know sometimes the sounds in the night aren't just the building settling. Sometimes someone is watching. The disappearing house. I grew up in a small town in rural Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone.
What is why?
It was quiet, safe, the kind of town where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. But there was one place everyone avoided, the house at the end of Holloway Road. No one knew who built it. No one knew who owned it. It had just always been there. A 2-story Victorian with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch. The windows were always dark, and no cars ever parked in the overgrown driveway. The house wasn't abandoned exactly, but it felt wrong, like it was waiting for something. One summer when I was 13, my friends and I dared each other to go inside. We had spent years making up ghost stories about the house, but none of us had ever actually set foot past the front gate. That night, armed with flashlights and teenage bravado, we climbed over the rusted fence and made our way to the front door. It was unlocked. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something metallic. The floorboards creaked under our weight as we stepped inside. The house was strangely empty. No furniture, no signs of life, just endless dark rooms and long hallways that seemed to stretch further than the house should allow. We split up, our voices echoing off the empty walls. I wandered into what must have been the living room, my flashlight beam flickering across faded wallpaper, and then I saw it. A picture frame, still hanging on the wall. It was the only thing in the entire house. The photo inside was yellowed and faded, but I could still make out the figures, a family of 4 standing on the very porch we had just walked across. But their faces were wrong, blurred, distorted, as if something had melted their features away. A chill ran down my spine. I turned to call my friends, but the words died in my throat. The house was changing. The hallway I had come through was no longer there. In its place was another door, slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief second, I saw something move in the shadows, a figure, tall and thin, watching me. I screamed and ran blindly through the house, crashing into walls, doors, anything to get away. I heard my friends yelling my name from somewhere far away, but their voices sounded warped, distant. Then just as suddenly as it started, I burst through the front door and onto the porch. My friends were already outside, their faces pale. "What the hell happened to you?" one of them asked. I turned, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house stood there, silent and dark, just as it always had, but something was different. The front door was gone. We ran. We never spoke about that night again. Not really. But the next day when we passed by Holloway Road, the house wasn't there anymore. It had disappeared. An empty lot sat where it should have been, overgrown with weeds and littered with broken wood and debris, as if the house had been abandoned for decades. But we knew better. It hadn't been abandoned. It had been waiting. Years passed and I moved away for college, eager to leave my small town and its lingering ghosts behind. But no matter how far I went, I could never forget that night, or the way the house had simply vanished. Then one evening, I got a call from my childhood friend Daniel, the same one who had been with me that night. His voice was shaking. "Dude, it's back." At first I thought he was joking, but he wasn't. He sent me a photo, Holloway Road, same as it had always been. But now, standing where the empty lot had been for years, was the house. It looked exactly the same. The peeling paint, the sagging porch, the dark windows, as if it had never been gone. Curiosity got the better of me. I drove back to my hometown the next weekend, meeting Daniel near the lot. It was real. The house was back, and I could feel the same wrongness I had felt years ago, creeping into my bones. "I saw someone inside," Daniel whispered, "in the upstairs window. We should have left, but something about the house pulled us in again, just like before. This time the front door wasn't unlocked. It was wide open. We stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the dust-heavy air. The same emptiness greeted us, but something felt different. I turned toward the living room, half expecting to see the strange photograph still hanging there. It was, but the image had changed. The family was still there, but now, there were 5 people in the picture. Daniel and I stared at it, our stomachs twisting in fear. The 5th figure stood slightly behind the family, its face blurred beyond recognition. Then as we watched, the photo flickered, like a glitching screen, and the 5th figure moved. A slow, jerky motion. It was turning toward us. We bolted. We didn't stop running until we were back in Daniel's car, breathless and shaking. As we sped away, I dared to look back. The house was gone. Again, neither of us ever returned to Holloway Road after that. But sometimes I dream of it, and in those dreams, the house is waiting, and the 5th figure is watching. Part 1. The map that shouldn't exist. It started with a simple road trip. James and his best friend, Mark, had spent the past year planning their perfect escape, just the two of them. A truck full of supplies and miles of open road. They had no destination, just a desire to explore the forgotten places of America. One evening, while passing through rural Pennsylvania, they stopped at an old gas station off a nearly deserted highway. The attendant was an elderly man, with cloudy eyes, sitting in a chair behind the counter, watching a tiny black and white TV that flickered in it, out of static. "Y'all heading anywhere in particular?" The man rasped, barely looking up. "Nope, just exploring," James replied, grabbing a worn-out map from a shelf. He wasn't sure why he even needed one. His phone had GPS, but something about the old paper intrigued him. Mark leaned over, peering at the faded lines and dots. "What's this town?" He pointed to a small unmarked location labeled Dunridge. The old man's eyes darkened. He stood slowly and reached across the counter, yanking the map from James's hands. "That town ain't there," the man said flatly. Mark raised an eyebrow. "It's right here on the..." I said it ain't there. James and Mark exchanged an amused glance. But the man wasn't joking. He folded the map, shoved it into James's hands and whispered, "You best be careful where you wander." Feeling a chill in the air, they nodded and left. But once back in the truck, curiosity won. "What do you think?" "Quick detour." Mark grinned. James hesitated, then shrugged. "Why not?" They didn't realize that decision would cost them everything. Part 2. The road to nowhere. Following the map, they turned onto an overgrown road that wasn't listed on Google Maps. No street signs, no mile markers, just a narrow, cracked pavement path that disappeared into thick, looming trees. "Weird," Mark muttered, eyes scanning the darkening woods. "Feels like we're driving into a horror movie." James chuckled nervously, but kept going. The road wound through dense forest for miles. No lights, no houses, no sign of civilization. Yet the map insisted Dunridge was just ahead. Then suddenly, street lights dimmed, Flickering bulbs lined the road, casting eerie yellow glows on old wooden buildings. They had arrived. Dunridge looked frozen in time. The storefronts were outdated, cars rusted along the curbs, and the sidewalks were no people, no movement, just an unnatural stillness. Mark checked his phone. No signal. James pulled the truck to a stop. Let's check it out. As they stepped outside, the air felt heavy, like walking through unseen cobwebs. The silence was suffocating. No birds, no wind, just their footsteps echoing in the empty streets. A diner sat on the corner, its neon sign buzzing faintly. Open 24 hours. They stepped inside. Part 3. The people who shouldn't be there. The diner's interior was straight out of the 1950s. A jukebox hummed a tune James didn't recognize. Vinyl booths lined the walls, and behind the counter stood a waitress in an old-fashioned uniform, staring blankly at them. "Hi," Mark said. The woman didn't blink. James cleared his throat. "Sorry if we're intruding. You shouldn't be here." Her voice was eerily flat. Mark shifted uncomfortably. "We just saw the town on a map, and the map lies." James felt a shiver crawl up his spine. Then the bell above the diner door jingled. They turned. A man in a dark suit stood in the doorway. He had no expression, no emotion in his cold, glassy eyes. Behind him, more figures began appearing outside. Men, women, children, all standing perfectly still, staring at them. The waitress's voice dropped to a whisper. "You have to leave." Mark grabbed James's arm. "We should go." They turned to leave, but the door was now locked. The suited man stepped forward. "You shouldn't have come." The windows darkened, as if something outside had swallowed the light. Shadows stretched unnaturally, creeping across the walls. The jukebox began to warp, its music distorting into a garbled mess of static and whispers. James's heartbeat pounded in his ears. "What the hell is this place?" Mark grabbed a chair and threw it at the window. It didn't break. The waitress backed away, fear finally surfacing on her face. "They don't let outsiders leave." The suited man took another step, and the shadows at his feet writhed, moving against the floor like living tendrils. "Run." Part 4. The escape. That wasn't James, and Mark bolted for the back door. They crashed into the alley, sprinting toward their truck. The street was now lined with silent figures, their empty eyes following. James yanked the door handle. Locked. Mark cursed. "Keys, keys." Then a whisper slithered through the air. Too late. The truck's headlights flickered. Then, its engine roared to life, but neither of them had touched it. The truck reversed on its own, speeding backward down the road and vanishing into the night. "No, no!" James screamed. Footsteps approached. The suited man was only a few feet away now. The shadows beneath him pulsed, spreading toward them. Mark grabbed James's wrist. "Run!" They sprinted down the street, but the town was changing. Buildings twisted and stretched. Roads coiled like snakes. No matter which way they ran, they always ended up back in the center of town. The crowd of silent figures grew. Hundreds now. Their whispers melded into one unnatural chorus. "You are part of us now." Mark clutched his head. "James, I can't think." James grabbed him. "We have to get out." But there was no exit, only darkness swallowing everything. Then, the suited man raised his hand, and everything went black. Part 5. The aftermath. James woke up in a hospital bed. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Birds chirped. A nurse noticed he was awake and rushed over. "You're okay," she said. "You were found on the side of the highway." James's head ached. "What happened? Where's Mark?" The nurse's expression faltered. "Who?" James's blood turned to ice. "Mark, my friend. We were in Dunridge." She frowned. "Sir, there is no Dunridge." James tried to argue, but the moment he said the name, a sharp pain lanced through his skull. The nurse watched with concern. "Just rest," she said softly. James lay back, but he knew the truth. There was a Dunridge. They had gone there. They had seen the town. But now, it was as if Mark had never existed. And in the darkest corners of his mind, James swore he could still hear the whispers. The rain had been falling for hours, a steady rhythm against the roof of the old house. It was a sound that should have been soothing, a lullaby against the silence of the night. But for Emma, lying awake in the unfamiliar bed, it was nothing more than a reminder that she was trapped. The house belonged to her grandmother, an old Victorian estate, deep in the countryside. It had been abandoned for years, ever since her grandmother passed. Now, after years of neglect, it stood alone, forgotten,
with its peeling wallpaper and hollowed-out rooms filled with dust and echoes of the past. Emma had come here to sort through the remains of a life she barely remembered. Her mother refused to step foot in the that house was never right, she had said. Not when I was a girl, not now. Emma had brushed off her warnings. The house was just that. A house, walls, a roof, memories, nothing more. But now, as the rain poured outside and the wind howled through the trees, she wasn't so sure. It wasn't the storm that kept her awake. It was the sound coming from above. At first, she thought it was the wind, a faint creaking, like old wood shifting under the pressure of the storm. But then it happened again, louder this time, a slow, deliberate movement, as if something heavy was shifting in the attic above her room. Emma held her breath, listening, a dragging sound. She sat up. The house had been empty for years, hadn't it? Maybe an animal had found its way inside, a raccoon or a stray cat. Then,
thump.
Something dropped directly above her, shaking the ceiling. Emma's skin prickled. That wasn't an animal. She reached for her phone, activating the flashlight as she climbed out of bed, her bare feet pressed against the cold wooden floor. As she stepped cautiously into the hallway, the attic door was at the end of the hall, a small square opening in the ceiling, with a wooden pull-down lid. It was closed. She stared at it, her heart pounding. No, it had to be an animal, maybe a loose branch hitting the roof. Shaking her head, she turned back to bed, but just as she closed her door, thump, 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 a slow, deliberate knocking from inside the attic. Emma didn't sleep that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds above, the thumping, the dragging, the occasional knock. By morning, the noises had stopped. Determined to find the source, she retrieved a flashlight and made her way to the attic door. Dust covered the pull string. It hadn't been touched in years. She hesitated, then pulled. The ladder creaked as it unfolded. A stale, musty scent drifted down from above, thick with dust and Emma pulled. The attic was dark, the wooden beams stretching like ribs in a forgotten skeleton. Boxes lay scattered, untouched, their labels faded. Old furniture stood like silent sentinels, draped in white sheets. She swept the flashlight across the space. Nothing, no sign of animals, no loose boards. Then why had it sounded like something was moving? She took a step forward and froze. In the farthest corner beneath the lowest part of the slanted roof, something was there, a shape, barely visible in the dim light. A bed, an old iron-framed bed, covered in a rotting mattress, and someone was lying in it. Emma's breath hitched. The figure beneath the sheets didn't move. It couldn't be real. No one had been in this house for years. It had to be a trick of the light, a forgotten mannequin, a pile of old blankets. She took a cautious step closer. The air around the bed was cold, freezing. The dust on the floor was disturbed, forming faint erratic trails, as if something had crawled there. Emma's flashlight flickered. The shape beneath the sheets shifted. A slow, rattling breath filled the attic. Emma stumbled backward, her heart slamming against her ribs. The flashlight flickered again, then died completely, plunging her into darkness. And then, a whisper, so close, right beside her ear. "You shouldn't have come." Emma fled the attic, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. She wanted to leave, wanted to get in her car and drive away and never look back. But the storm had flooded the roads. She was trapped. By nightfall the house felt heavier, as if it were waiting. She locked her bedroom door, placed a chair beneath the handle, pulled the covers up to her chin, and squeezed her eyes shut. The rain beat against the windows, the wind howled through the trees, and then, from the attic, thump. She bit her lip, forcing herself not to move. Thump, thump, slow, deliberate, and then, the creak of the attic door opening. Terror wrapped around her like a vice. She listened, every muscle in her body rigid. Something stepped onto the landing. Not an animal, not a branch. Footsteps, heavy, dragging footsteps, moving toward her room. The chair against the door shuddered. Emma pressed a hand to her mouth, forcing herself not to scream. The handle rattled, and then, the whisper, "Let me in." The house that watches morning came, pale and cold. The storm had passed. The roads were clear. Emma didn't waste time. She grabbed her keys, threw open the front door, and froze. On the porch, outside her bedroom window, The chair she had placed beneath her door handle sat perfectly upright, as if someone had moved it, as if someone had wanted to let themselves in. She never stepped foot in that house again. She never told her mother what happened, but sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, when the world is quiet, and the rain taps against her apartment window, she swears she still hears it. The whisper, right outside her door, "Let me in." The waves lapped gently against the shore, their steady rhythm whispering an ancient lullaby to the quiet world. The sky was a deep, endless navy, speckled with stars that shimmered like distant lanterns. Somewhere, far beyond the horizon, the moon cast a silver path across the water, illuminating the lonely lighthouse that stood upon the cliffs. The Black Ridge Lighthouse had stood there for over a century, its beams slicing through the darkness, a silent guardian of the sea. Few people knew its history, and fewer still had ever spoken to the man who kept it. But he was there, an old man named Samuel Greaves, the last lighthouse keeper, and he had a secret. A night like any other, inside the lighthouse, the warmth of the crackling fire filled the cozy space, its glow flickering against the aged wooden walls. The scent of sea salt lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of old books and candle wax. Samuel sat in his chair, his old hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea, gazing into the flames as they danced in the hearth. He had lived here alone for years, long after lighthouses had become relics of the past, long after sailors had stopped depending on their beacons to guide them safely home. But he had never left. Every night he climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room, tending to the great light that still shone out across the ocean. And every night, without fail, he would sit by the fire, listen to the waves and wait. For what, he wasn't quite sure, but he always waited. The visitor on this particular night, as the wind hummed through the cracks in the old lighthouse walls, a soft knock echoed against the heavy wooden door. Samuel's brow furrowed. No one ever came here. He placed his teacup down, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer, and rose from his chair. The door creaked as he pulled it open. Standing in the moonlight was a woman. She was wrapped in a long dark coat, her hood pulled over her head obscuring most of her face. But even in the dim light, Samuel could see the glint of her curious eyes. "I didn't think anyone lived here," she said, her voice gentle as the breeze. Samuel studied her for a moment before stepping aside. "Would you like to come in?" She hesitated, then nodded, stepping over the threshold. Inside, the warmth of the fire seemed to embrace her, melting away the chill of the sea air. She pulled back her hood, revealing soft features and hair the color of autumn leaves. She couldn't have been more than 30, yet her eyes held something old, something familiar. Samuel gestured toward the chair opposite his own. "Tia?" She nodded again, her lips curling into a small knowing smile. A conversation by firelight. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the wind outside, the occasional hiss of a log shifting in the fire. "You've been here a long time," the woman finally said. Samuel chuckled, taking a slow sip of tea. "That obvious?" She smiled. "People in town say the lighthouse has been abandoned for years." Samuel exhaled, gazing at the flames. "I suppose in some ways it has." She tilted her head. "And yet the light is still on every night." He met her gaze then, something unspoken passing between them. After a long pause, he leaned back, eyes drifting toward the lantern room above them. "It's funny, isn't it?" he murmured. "We keep lights on even when no one is left to see them, just in case." She studied him. "In case of what?" Samuel hesitated before answering. "In case someone is still out there." The room was quiet for a moment, the only sound the distant crash of waves. Then she spoke again, softer this time. "Do you believe someone is?" Samuel let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening slightly around his cup. "Once," he said. "A long time ago." Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, as if she understood. The story of the Keeper's Watch. Samuel didn't often tell the story, but tonight, the words came easily. He spoke of a time when ships still relied on the lighthouse, when the sea was filled with vessels guided home by its steady beam. He had been younger then, and he had not been alone. There had been another keeper, James Holloway. They had worked side by side for years, tending to the lighthouse, sharing stories, drinking tea by the fire just as Samuel did now, until one fateful night, a storm had rolled in, one of the worst the coast had ever seen. The wind had howled through the cliffs, the waves rising like monsters in the dark. And somewhere out in that black abyss, a ship was struggling. James had seen it first. It's too close, he had said. They don't see the rocks. Without a second thought, he had grabbed his lantern and rushed out into the storm. Samuel had called after him, but James had already disappeared into the night. The storm raged until dawn. The ship never made it, and neither did James. They found his lantern washed up on the shore, its light still flickering weakly, but of James, there was no sign. Samuel had stayed in the lighthouse ever since, waiting, hoping. Because sometimes, on the nights when the wind was still, and the fog curled thick around the cliffs, he could still see it, a flickering lantern, far out in the lantern in the mid. When Samuel finished speaking, the fire had burned low, its embers glowing softly in the dim room. The woman sat quietly, her gaze distant, lost in thought. Finally she stood. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping the light on." Samuel nodded. She pulled her hood back over her head, stepping toward the door. But just as she reached for the handle, she paused. Then, without turning back, she whispered, "He's still out there." Samuel's breath caught, but before he could say anything, she was gone, disappearing into the misty night. For a long time he stood there, staring at the empty doorway, her words echoing in his mind. Then slowly he turned toward the window, and far, far out at sea, beyond the reach of his lighthouse's beam, he saw it, a small flickering light, a lantern, moving through the moon, waiting to be found.
The Leviathan's call to sea was calm that night. Too calm. Captain Elias Morrow stood at the helm of the Marianne, a weathered whaling vessel that had seen better days. The crew moved about the deck in uneasy silence, their lanterns casting long, flickering shadows against the mast. The air was thick with salt, and something else, something heavy, like the weight of a storm that hadn't yet broken. They had been tracking a whale for days. Not just any whale. This one was different. The lookouts had spotted it at dusk, its massive silhouette gliding just beneath the surface, blacker than the ink-dark water. It moved with purpose, as if it knew they were following, as if it wanted them to. First Mate Grayson adjusted the spyglass, his knuckles white. "Captain," he muttered, "that ain't no normal beast." Elias didn't answer. He had seen it too. The way the thing moved, unnatural, almost deliberate, and the sounds deep, guttural vibrations that thrummed through the hull, making the ship's timbers groan in response. Then, without warning, the sea erupted. A geyser of water exploded beside the Marianne, and the beast surfaced. It was a whale, yes, but wrong. Its skin was slick and pallid, stretched too tight over jagged bones that shouldn't have been there. Its eyes, God, its eyes, were milky white, sunken too deep, yet somehow watching, and its mouth, a yawning chasm lined with rows of needle-like teeth, twisted and broken, like they had grown wrong. The crew screamed. Some dropped to their knees, praying. Others ran, though there was nowhere to go. The thing screamed back. Not a whale's song, not anything natural. A sound like metal tearing, like 1,000 voices wailing from the depths. The lantern shattered. The deck trembled, and then it spoke. Not in words, not in any language a man could know. But they understood. "You should not have come." Elias felt his mind unraveling at the edges. He grabbed the harpoon, hands shaking. "Steady," he roared, though his voice was lost in the creature's shriek. The beast dove. The sea went still. For a breath, there was silence. Then, the Marianne lurched as something massive slammed into it from below. Wood splintered. Men screamed. The ship listed violently, the deck tilting toward the black water, and then the whale rose again. This time, beneath them, the ship was lifted, hull groaning, before the beast arched its spine and dove, dragging the Marianne down with it. Elias had one last glimpse of the crew, wide-eyed, reaching, mouths open in silent terror, before the water swallowed them all. The last thing he heard was the whale's voice, whispering in the dark, "You are mine now." And then nothing. 4 months later, a fisherman found the wreckage, what little was left, a few splintered planks, a single, rusted harpoon, and a journal, waterlogged but still legible in parts. The last entry was a single sentence, scrawled in frantic, shaking script. It wasn't a whale, and then beneath that, a final desperate plea. "It's still out there." The Leviathan's call. Part 2. The Marianne was gone, not just lost, erased. No bodies washed ashore, no wreckage beyond those few splintered boards. The sea had taken everything, swallowed it whole. The fishermen who found the remains crossed themselves and whispered of curses. The port authorities marked the crew as dead and moved on, but not everyone forgot. 6 weeks after the wreck, Jonah Vay sat in the dim light of a dockside tavern, the journal spread open before him. His hands, rough from years of hauling nets and tying knots, trembled as he traced the last words of Captain Elias Morrow. It wasn't a whale. Jonah had known Elias. They had sailed together years ago, before Jonah's leg had been crushed beneath a falling crate, leaving him with a permanent limp and a hatred for the sea that had crippled him. He had no love for whalers, but Elias had been different. A good man, a careful man. And now he was gone. Jonah flipped through the journal's ruined pages, piecing together the final days of the Marianne. The crew had been tracking something that moved wrong, something that watched them. And then the last entry. The plea. It's still out there. A hand slammed down on the table, making Jonah flinch. "You're wasting your time," growled a voice. Jonah looked up into the scarred face of Harlan Sykes, a grizzled old whaler with a reputation for surviving things no man should. His left arm ended in a stump at the elbow, the sleeve pinned up. Jonah had heard the stories. Something in the water had taken the rest. Harlan's eyes flicked to the journal. "You raid that damn thing, didn't you?" Jonah nodded. Harlan exhaled sharply through his nose and dropped into the chair across from him. "Then you know it ain't just some fish." Jonah leaned forward. "What was it?" Harlan didn't answer at first. He signaled the barmaid for a bottle of rum, took a long swig, and then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. When he spoke again, his voice was low. "Ever hear of the Daggerfin?" Jonah frowned. "The whaler that vanished off the Black Banks?" Harlan nodded. "I was on it." Jonah's blood ran cold. Harlan's gaze was distant, locked on something only he could see. "We found something out there. Big, wrong. It didn't just attack the ship. It played with us, like a cat with a mouse. Tore the Daggerfin apart slow. Most of the men drowned. Some it took." He flexed the stump of his arm. "I got lucky." Jonah swallowed. "You think it's the same thing that took the Marianne?" Harlan's lips peeled back in something too grim to be a smile. "I know it is." The offer 2 nights later. Jonah stood on the deck of the Widow's Hand, a rusted, weather-beaten steamer that had seen better decades. Harlan had called in every favor he had left to get it seaworthy. "You're insane," Jonah muttered, as he watched the crew load supplies. Harlan chuckled. "Probably. You think we can kill it?" Harlan's expression darkened. "I think we can try." Jonah hesitated. "And if we can't?" Harlan met his gaze. "Then we die screaming." The engine rumbled to life. The Widow's Hand pulled away from the dock, cutting through the black water. Behind them, the last lights of the port vanished. Ahead, only darkness, and the thing that waited. The hunt begins. 3 days out, they found the first sign, a ship's figurehead floating in the water. The wood was rotted, the paint long gone, but the face, a woman's, her mouth open in a silent scream, was eerily preserved. Harlan stared at it, then spat over the rail. Bad omen. That night the crew heard it, a sound deep below the hull, not the steady thrum of the engine, not the waves, something else, a pulse, like a heartbeat. Jonah stood at the rail, staring down into the inky water. For a moment he thought he saw something move, a shadow, vast and shapeless, sliding beneath the ship. Then it was gone, but the pulse remained. Thump, 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 getting louder, getting closer. Jonah backed away from the rail, his breath coming fast. Harlan appeared beside him, his face grim. "It knows we're here," he whispered, and then the sea erupted. Chapter 1. The mischievous beginnings. In a small, secluded village nestled deep within the rolling hills of Ireland, there lived a man named Jack. Jack was known far and wide, not for his kindness or his bravery, but for his cunning and deceitful nature. He was a trickster, a man who could talk his way out of any situation, and who had a knack for getting into trouble. Jack was the kind of man who would sell his own mother for a pint of ale, and then convince her to pay for it. Jack's reputation was well earned. He had spent his entire life pulling pranks, telling lies, and swindling anyone who crossed his path. But despite his many misdeeds, Jack had managed to avoid any serious consequences. He was always one step ahead, always ready with a clever excuse or a quick escape. But Jack's luck was about to run out. One fateful evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the village was bathed in the golden light of dusk, Jack found himself in the local tavern. He was deep in his cups, his laughter echoing off the wooden walls as he regaled the patrons with tales of his latest exploits. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere in the tavern grew tense. The villagers were growing tired of Jack's antics, and whispers of his misdeeds began to circulate. It was then that the door to the tavern creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to the stranger. He was tall and gaunt, with a face that seemed to be carved from stone. His eyes burned with an otherworldly light, and his presence sent a chill through the room. This was no ordinary man. This was the devil himself. The devil had come for Jack. Chapter 2. A deal with the devil. Jack's heart raced as he realized who had entered the tavern. He had heard the stories, of course, tales of the devil coming to claim the souls of the wicked. But Jack had always dismissed them as mere superstition. Now faced with the reality of the devil's presence, Jack knew he had to think fast. The devil approached Jack, his eyes locked on the trickster. "Jack," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I have come for your soul. Your time has come." Jack's mind raced. He knew he couldn't outrun the devil, and he certainly couldn't fight him. But Jack was a master of deception, and he had one last trick up his sleeve. "Wait," Jack said, holding up a hand. "Before you take me, let me have one last drink. A final toast to my life." The devil considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Very well," he said. "One last drink." Jack called for the bartender to bring him a pint of ale. As the bartender poured the drink, Jack's mind worked furiously. He needed a way to outsmart the devil, to buy himself more time. And then an idea came to him. As the bartender handed Jack his drink, Jack raised the glass and said, "To my life, and to the devil who has come to claim it." The devil raised an eyebrow, intrigued by Jack's boldness. But before he could react, Jack threw the ale in the devil's face. The devil roared in anger, his eyes blazing with fury. But Jack was already moving. He grabbed a nearby candle and held it up to the devil's face. "If you want my soul," Jack said, "you'll have to catch me first." With that, Jack bolted out of the tavern, the devil hot on his heels. Jack ran through the village, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he couldn't outrun the devil forever, but he had bought himself some time. As Jack ran, he came across a large apple tree. Without thinking, he climbed up into the branches, hoping to hide from the devil. The devil soon arrived at the base of the tree, his eyes scanning the branches for any sign of Jack. "Jack," the devil bellowed, "you cannot hide from me." But Jack was silent, his breath coming in short gasps as he clung to the branches. The devil began to climb the tree, his claws digging into the bark as he ascended. Jack knew he had to act fast. As the devil reached the branch where Jack was hiding, Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver cross. He held it up to the devil, who recoiled in horror.
"Be gone, devil!"
Jack shouted, "You cannot have my soul." The devil snarled, but he could not approach the cross. He knew he had been outsmarted. With a final glare, the devil descended from the tree and disappeared into the night. Jack let out a sigh of relief, but he knew his troubles were far from over. He had escaped the devil's clutches for now, but he had made a powerful enemy, and Jack knew that the devil would not forget this slight. Chapter 3. The second encounter. Years passed, and Jack continued his life of mischief and deceit, but he could never shake the memory of his encounter with the devil. He knew that one day, the devil would return to claim his soul, and Jack was determined to be ready. One dark and stormy night, as Jack was walking home from the tavern, he felt a familiar chill in the air. He turned, and there, standing in the middle of the road, was the devil. "Jack," the devil said, his voice dripping with malice, "you cannot escape me forever. Your soul is mine." But Jack was ready. He had spent years preparing for this moment, and he had a plan. "Wait," Jack said, holding up a hand. "Before you take me, let me ask you one question." The devil narrowed his eyes, but he nodded. "Very well," he said, "ask your question." Jack took a deep breath. "If you are truly the most powerful being in the world," he said, "then prove it. Turn yourself into a coin." The devil laughed, a deep rumbling sound that sent shivers down Jack's spine.
"You think to challenge me, Jack?"
He said, "Very well, I will show you my power." With a wave of his hand, the devil transformed himself into a shiny gold coin. Jack quickly picked up the coin and examined it. It was a perfect likeness of the devil, with his twisted horns and malevolent grin. But Jack had no intention of letting the devil out of his sight. He slipped the coin into his pocket, where he had placed a small silver cross. The devil, trapped in the form of a coin, could not escape. Jack smiled to himself. He had outsmarted the devil once again. Chapter 4. The final bargain. But Jack's victory was short-lived. The devil, though trapped, was not defeated. He bided his time, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, as Jack was walking through the forest, he heard a voice calling his name. It was the devil, his voice echoing through the trees. "Jack," the devil said, "you cannot keep me trapped forever. Release me, and I will grant you one final wish." Jack hesitated. He knew that the devil was cunning, and that any deal he made would come with a price. But he was also curious. What could the devil offer him that he didn't already have? "Very well," Jack said, "I will release you, but in return, you must promise never to claim my soul." The devil laughed. "You drive a hard bargain, Jack," he said. "But very well, I agree to your terms." Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out the coin. He placed it on the ground and stepped back. The coin began to glow, and in a flash of light, the devil stood before him once more. "Thank you, Jack," the devil said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You have proven yourself to be a worthy adversary. But remember, our deal is binding. I will never claim your soul." With that, the devil disappeared into the night, leaving Jack alone in the forest. Chapter 5. The Eternal Wanderer.
Jack's troubles were far from over.
Though the devil had promised never to claim his soul, Jack had not considered what would happen when his time on earth came to an end. When Jack finally died, he found himself at the gates of heaven. But the angels turned him away, for Jack had led a life of sin and deceit. He was not worthy of entering the kingdom of God. Desperate, Jack went to the gates of hell, but the devil, true to his word, refused to claim his soul. "You made a deal, Jack," the devil said with a smirk.
"I cannot take you into hell."
And so, Jack was left to wander the earth for all eternity. A lost soul with no place to call home. The devil, taking pity on him, gave him a single ember from the fires of hell to light his way. Jack placed the ember inside a hollowed-out turnip, creating a lantern to guide him through the darkness. From that day forward, Jack became known as Jack-o'-lantern, the eternal wanderer. His lantern, with its eerie glow, became a symbol of his restless spirit, and every year, on the night of Halloween, people would carve turnips, and later pumpkins into lanterns, placing them outside their homes to ward off evil spirits, and to remember the tale of Jack-o'-lantern, the man who outsmarted the devil, but could never escape his fate. Chapter 6. The Legacy of Jack-o'-lantern. As the years passed, the legend of Jack-o'-lantern spread far and wide. People began to carve their own lanterns, placing them outside their homes to protect themselves from evil spirits. The tradition grew, and soon, Jack-o'-lantern became a symbol of Halloween, a night when the veil between the living and the dead was at its thinnest. In Ireland, where the legend began, people would carve turnips into grotesque faces, placing a candle inside to create a flickering light. They would place these lanterns outside their homes, hoping to scare away any wandering spirits. But as Irish immigrants brought the tradition to America, they found that pumpkins, which were larger and easier to carve, made for better lanterns, and so, the Jack-o'-lantern, as we know it today, was born. But the legend of Jack-o'-lantern is more than just a spooky tale. It is a cautionary story, a reminder of the consequences of a life lived in deceit and trickery. Jack's cunning may have saved him from the devil, but it also condemned him to an eternity of wandering, a soul without a home. And so, every Halloween, as we carve our pumpkins and place them outside our homes, we remember the tale of Jack-o'-lantern. We remember the man who outsmarted the devil, but who could never escape the consequences of his actions. And we remember that, in the end, it is not our cleverness or our cunning that will save us, but the choices we make and the lives we lead. Chapter 7. The Modern Jack-o'-lantern. Today, the Jack-o'-lantern is a staple of Halloween celebrations around the world. From small, simple carvings to elaborate, intricate designs, people of all ages enjoy the tradition of creating their own lanterns. But the spirit of Jack-o'-lantern lives on, not just in the flickering light of a pumpkin, but in the stories we tell and the lessons we learn. As we gather around the glow of a jack-o'-lantern, we are reminded of the power of storytelling, of the way a simple tale can capture our imaginations and teach us important lessons. The legend of Jack-o'-lantern is more than just a spooky story. It is a reminder of the importance of honesty, of the consequences of our actions, and of the eternal struggle between good and evil. So this Halloween, as you carve your pumpkin and place it outside your door, take a moment to remember the tale of Jack-o'-lantern. Remember the man who outsmarted the devil, but who could never escape his fate. And remember that, in the end,
It is not our cleverness or our cunning that will save us, but the choices we make and the lives we lead. And as the light of your jack-o'-lantern flickers in the night, know that you are carrying on a tradition that has been passed down through generations, a tradition that reminds us of the power of stories and of the lessons they can teach us. For in the end, it is not the light of the lantern that guides us, but the light of the stories we tell and the lessons we learn from them. Chapter 8. The Endless Journey. And so, Jack-o'-lantern continues his endless journey, wandering the earth with his lantern in hand. He is a reminder of the consequences of a life lived in deceit, and of the importance of making the right choices. But he is also a symbol of the power of storytelling, of the way a simple tale can capture our imaginations and teach us important lessons. As we celebrate Halloween and the tradition of the jack-o'-lantern, let us remember the tale of the man who outsmarted the devil, but could never escape his fate. Let us remember the importance of honesty, of the consequences of our actions, and of the eternal struggle between good and evil. And as we carve our pumpkins and place them outside our homes, let us remember that the light of the jack-o'-lantern is more than just a flickering flame. It is a reminder of the power of stories, and of the lessons they can teach us. For in the end, it is not the light of the lantern that guides us, but the light of the stories we tell, and the lessons we learn from them. And so, the legend of Jack-o'-lantern lives on, a timeless tale that continues to captivate and inspire us, year after year, generation after generation. And as long as we continue to tell his story, Jack-o'-lantern will never truly be alone, for his light will continue to shine, guiding us through the darkness, and reminding us of the power of the stories we tell. Epilogue. The Eternal Flame. As the years turned into centuries, the legend of Jack-o'-lantern continued to evolve. The tale of the cunning trickster who outsmarted the devil became a cornerstone of folklore, not just in Ireland, but across the world. The jack-o'-lantern, once a simple turnip lantern, became a symbol of Halloween, a night when the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred, and the spirits of the past walked among the living. In the small village where Jack had once lived, the people continued to honor his memory. Every year, on the night of Halloween, they would gather in the town square, each family bringing their own carved lantern. The flickering lights of the jack-o'-lanterns would illuminate the night, casting eerie shadows on the cobblestone streets. The villagers would tell stories of Jack's exploits, of his cunning and his deceit, and of his eternal wandering. But as the years passed, the true meaning of the jack-o'-lantern began to fade. For many, it became simply a fun tradition, a way to celebrate Halloween with spooky decorations. The deeper lessons of Jack's story, of the consequences of a life lived in deceit, of the importance of honesty and integrity, were often forgotten. Yet, in the hearts of those who truly understood the legend, the spirit of Jack-o'-lantern lived on. They knew that the flickering light of the lantern was more than just a decoration. It was a reminder of the eternal struggle between good and evil, of the choices we make, and of the consequences that follow. And so, as the world continued to change, the legend of Jack-o'-lantern remained a constant, a timeless tale that continued to captivate and inspire. The light of the jack-o'-lantern, though born from a single ember from the fires of hell, became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always a light to guide us. And as long as the story of Jack-o'-lantern is told, his light will continue to shine, a beacon in the night, reminding us of the power of stories, and of the lessons they can teach us. For in the end, it is not the light of the lantern that guides us, but the light of the stories we tell, and the lessons we learn from them. And so, the legend of Jack-o'-lantern lives on, an eternal flame that will never be extinguished, a reminder of the power of storytelling, and of the lessons that can be learned from the tales of the past. And as long as we continue to tell his story, Jack-o'-lantern will never truly be alone, for his light will continue to shine, guiding us through the darkness, and reminding us of the power of the stories we tell. The End. Chapter 1. The Call of the Forest. Eliza Harper had always been drawn to the unknown. As a writer, she thrived on mysteries, the kind that sent shivers down your spine, and made you question the very fabric of reality. So, when she first heard the legends of the Black Hollow Forest, she knew she had to see it for herself. The forest was a sprawling expanse of ancient trees, their gnarled branches twisting toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Locals called it the Whispering Woods, for it was said that the trees spoke to those who dared to enter. Some claimed to have heard voices calling their names, while others spoke of ghostly apparitions that danced between the trees. But the most chilling tale was that of a malevolent force that lurked in the shadows, waiting to claim the souls of the unwary. Eliza had spent weeks researching the forest, poring over old books and interviewing villagers who lived on its outskirts. The stories were always the same. Travelers who ventured into the woods never returned, and those who did were never the same. They spoke of a darkness that clung to them, a weight that pressed down on their chests long after they had left the forest behind. But Eliza was a skeptic. She believed in logic, in reason, and she was determined to uncover the truth behind the legends. So, on a crisp autumn morning, she packed her bag with a notebook, a camera, and a few provisions, and set out for the Black Hollow Forest. Chapter 2. The Edge of Darkness. The journey to the forest was uneventful, but as Eliza approached its edge, she felt a chill run down her spine. The air was unnaturally still, and the sunlight seemed to dim as it filtered through the dense canopy above. She paused for a moment, taking in the sight of the towering trees that loomed before her. Their bark was blackened, as if scorched by some long-forgotten fire, and their roots twisted and coiled like serpents beneath the earth. Eliza took a deep breath and stepped into the forest. At first everything seemed normal. Birds chirped in the distance, and the wind rustled through the branches. But as she ventured deeper, the atmosphere changed. The birds fell silent, and the wind died down, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Eliza felt as though she were being watched, but every time she turned around, there was nothing there. Hours passed, and the forest grew darker. Eliza checked her compass, but the needle spun wildly, as if the very magnetic field of the earth had been disrupted. She tried to retrace her steps, but the trees seemed to shift and rearrange themselves, trapping her in a labyrinth of shadows. Panic began to set in, but Eliza forced herself to stay calm. She reminded herself that forests could be disorienting, and that she just needed to find a way out. Chapter 3. The Guardian of the Forest. As night fell, Eliza decided to set up camp. She found a small clearing and lit a fire, hoping its warmth would ward off the growing sense of...
Prologue. The Whispering Woods. The town of Black Hollow was a place forgotten by time. Nestled deep within the Whispering Woods, it was a town where the sun rarely touched the ground, and the air always carried the faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the trees as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. They knew the woods were alive, not with animals or wind, but with something far older, far darker. It was said that the woods whispered to those who listened too closely, and those who wandered too far into its depths never returned. But for Clara, a young woman new to Black Hollow, the woods were just trees. She didn't believe in the stories. Not yet. Chapter 1. The arrival. Clara had come to Black Hollow to escape. Her life in the city had become a suffocating mess of broken relationships, dead-end jobs, and a lingering sense of emptiness. When she inherited her late aunt's cottage on the edge of the Whispering Woods, she saw it as a chance to start over. The cottage was old, with creaking floorboards and windows that rattled in the wind, but it was hers. For the first time in years, Clara felt a flicker of hope. The drive to Black Hollow was long and lonely. The road wound through dense forests, the trees pressing in on either side like silent sentinels. By the time Clara reached the town, the sun had set, and the woods were cloaked in darkness. The town itself was small, with a single main street lined with weathered buildings. A general store, a post office, and a dimly lit tavern were the only signs of life. Clara parked her car outside the cottage and stepped inside for the first time. The air was musty, and the floorboards groaned under her weight. She flicked on the lights, but the bulbs flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the room. The furniture was old but sturdy, covered in dust sheets that she quickly pulled away. A large stone fireplace dominated the living room, and Clara imagined herself sitting by it on cold nights, a book in hand. As she unpacked her belongings, she found herself glancing out the window at the woods. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Clara shook her head, chiding herself for being so easily spooked. She was a rational person, a woman of science. She didn't believe in ghosts or monsters. But as the night deepened, she began to hear a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like voices carried on the wind. Chapter 2. The First Night. The whispers grew louder as the night deepened. Clara tried to ignore them, burying herself under blankets and pressing a pillow to her ears. But the voices were insistent, a cacophony of murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a plea, a warning, a call. At dawn, the whispers faded, and Clara emerged from her room, exhausted but determined to put the night behind her. She spent the day unpacking, cleaning, and exploring the cottage. It was a charming place, with its stone walls and wooden beams, but there was something off about it. The air felt heavier inside, and the shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. That night, the whispers returned. This time, Clara couldn't ignore them. She followed the sound to the attic, where she found an old dust-covered chest. Inside was a collection of journals, their pages filled with her aunt's handwriting. Clara sat on the floor, reading by the light of a flickering lantern. The journals told a story Clara could barely comprehend. Her aunt had written about the woods, about the whispers, about something that lived among the trees. She called it the hollowing, a force that fed on fear and regret, that twisted the minds of those who listened too closely. Her aunt had tried to resist it, but in the end, the hollowing had claimed her. Clara closed the journal, her hands trembling. She told herself it was just the ramblings of a lonely old woman, but deep down, she knew better. The whispers were real, and they were calling to her. Chapter 3. The shadows deepen over the next few days. Clara tried to settle into her new life. She explored the town, met a few of the locals, and even started a small garden behind the cottage. But the whispers never left her. They followed her everywhere, growing louder and more insistent with each passing night. She began to see things, shadows moving in the corners of her vision, figures standing at the edge of the woods. At first she told herself it was just her imagination, but the sightings became harder to dismiss. One night, as she stood at the window, she saw a figure standing in the yard. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness. Clara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure raised a hand, beckoning her to come closer. She slammed the curtain shut and locked the door, but the image stayed with her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was watching her, waiting for her. Chapter 4. The descent. Clara's nights became a waking nightmare. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and the shadows seemed to close in around her. She stopped sleeping, afraid of what she might see in her dreams. Her once neat cottage became a mess of scattered journals, empty teacups, and unwashed clothes. She barely recognized herself in the mirror. Her eyes were sunken, her skin pale. One night, unable to bear the whispers any longer, Clara ventured into the woods. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted like gnarled fingers. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground beneath her feet was soft and yielding. She followed the whispers deeper
into the woods.
Her lantern casting flickering shadows on the trees. She didn't know how long she walked, but eventually she came to a clearing. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk twisted and blackened as if burned. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from the tree itself. Clara stepped closer, her lantern trembling in her hand. As she reached out to touch the tree, the ground beneath her gave way, and she fell into darkness. Chapter 5. The hollowing. Clara awoke in a cavern, the walls slick with moisture, and the air thick with the stench of rot. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deafening silence. She stood, her legs trembling, and looked around. The cavern was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow. In the center stood a figure. The same figure she had seen in her yard. It was tall and gaunt, its skin pale. A surge of icy pain, and then everything went black. Chapter 6. The Awakening. When Clara awoke, she was back in her cottage. The sun was shining through the windows, and the whispers were gone. For a moment, she thought it had all been a dream, but as she stood, she noticed something was different. The shadows seemed darker, the air heavier, and when she looked in the mirror, she saw that her eyes were no longer her own. They were hollow, empty. The hollowing had claimed her. Epilogue. The Whispering Woods. The townsfolk of Black Hollow never saw Clara again. Her cottage stood empty, its windows dark, and its door locked. But sometimes on quiet nights, they would hear whispers coming from the woods, and they would see shadows moving among the trees. And deep within the Whispering Woods, the hollowing continued to grow, its voice carried on the wind, calling to those who would listen. Title: The Clockmaker's Daughter. Prologue. Of timepieces, each one meticulously crafted by the town's legendary clockmaker, Elias Grayson. Elias was a man of precision, of order, of unwavering dedication to his craft. His clocks were more than mere machines. They were works of art, each one imbued with a sense of life that seemed to transcend the gears and springs that powered them. But Elias's greatest creation was not a clock, it was his daughter, Lila. Lila was a child of the workshop, raised among the ticking and chiming of her father's creations. She had inherited his talent, his patience, and
The architecture both beautiful and foreboding. The stone walls were weathered, the windows dark and lifeless, and the roof sagged under the weight of time. Eleanor parked her car and stepped out, her boots crunching on the gravel driveway. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. She approached the front door, its heavy oak panels carved with intricate patterns of vines and thorns. The key Mr. Whitmore had given her turned with a loud click, and the door creaked open. The interior was exactly as she had imagined, decaying and frozen in time. The grand foyer was dominated by a sweeping staircase, its banisters adorned with carvings of twisted serpents. Portraits of the Blackthorn family lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow her as she moved. Eleanor set up camp in the library, a room filled with towering bookshelves and a large ornate deck. She lit a few candles to combat the dim light and began her work, cataloging the artifacts and documents she found. But as the hours passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Chapter 3. The first night. As night fell, the manor came alive with sounds. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and the floorboards creaked as if someone or something was walking through the halls. Eleanor tried to ignore it, focusing on her work, but the noises grew louder, more insistent. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of pages in a book, but soon they grew louder, more distinct. Eleanor strained to listen, but the voices were unintelligible, a cacophony of murmurs and sighs that seemed to come from all around her. She stood, her heart pounding, and scanned the room. There was nothing there.
Hello,
She called out, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and lifeless. She wore a tattered dress that seemed to blend into the darkness, and her hair hung in matted strands around her face. Eleanor froze, her breath caught in her throat.
leave this place, the woman said,
Her voice a hoarse whisper.
You do not belong here.
Eleanor's mind raced. She had always believed in rational explanations, but what she was seeing defied all logic. Who are you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's lips curled into a grim smile. I am the guardian of this manor. I am the one who keeps the darkness at bay, but even I cannot protect you if you stay. Before Eleanor could respond, the woman vanished, leaving only the faint scent of decay in the air. Eleanor sat down heavily, her legs trembling. She knew she should leave, but something compelled her to stay. She needed to understand the mystery of Blackthorn Manor. Chapter 4. The Journal.
The next morning, Eleanor continued her exploration, her encounter with the ghostly woman weighing heavily on her mind. As she searched the library, she found a hidden compartment in the desk. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The journal belonged to Alistair Blackthorn, the last owner of the manor. As Eleanor read, she learned of his descent into madness. He spoke of a curse that had plagued his family for generations, a darkness that fed on their fears and consumed their souls. The final entry was chilling. The shadows are closing in. I can hear them whispering, calling my name. They want me to join them, to become one with the darkness, but I will not let them win. I will end this, once and for all. Eleanor realized that the fire that had claimed the Blackthorn family was no accident. Alistair had set the manor ablaze in a desperate attempt to destroy the curse, but it hadn't worked. The darkness was still here, waiting for its next victim. Chapter 5. The Breaking of the Curse. In a moment of clarity, Eleanor understood what she had to do. She found a vial of salt in her supplies, a gift from her grandmother, who had always believed in the power of protection. She poured the salt around the library, forming a circle of protection. As she did, the darkness recoiled, the whispers fading into silence. The manor seemed to exhale, the tension lifting as the malevolent force retreated. Eleanor felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see the ghostly woman standing beside her. Her face was no longer gaunt, but serene, her eyes filled with gratitude. You have done what I could not, the woman said. You have broken the curse. Eleanor blinked, and the woman was gone. The manor was silent, the whispers replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves outside. The sun broke through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room. Eleanor knew that the darkness was gone, and Blackthorn Manor was finally at peace. Chapter 6. The Journey Home. As Eleanor made her way out of the manor, she felt a sense of closure. She had uncovered the truth, not just about the manor, but about herself. She had faced her fears and emerged stronger for it, and though she would never forget the horrors she had witnessed, she knew that Blackthorn Manor would always hold a special place in her heart. When she returned to the town, the locals were astonished to see her. They had assumed she had become another victim of the manor, but Eleanor simply smiled and told them that the curse had been broken. She didn't explain how she knew, but somehow they believed her. Eleanor returned to her life, but she was forever changed by her experience. She wrote a book about Blackthorn Manor, sharing the story of the curse and the family it had destroyed. The book became a bestseller, and people from all over the world came to visit the manor, now free from its dark past. But Eleanor never returned to Blackthorn Manor. She had done what
what she had set out to do, and she knew that some mysteries were better left undisturbed. Instead, she carried the manor with her, in her heart and in her memories, a reminder of the strength she had found within herself. Epilogue: The legacy of the manor. Years later, Eleanor sat by the window of her cozy cottage, watching the leaves fall from the trees. She was older now, her hair streaked with gray, but her eyes still sparkled with the same curiosity that had led her to Blackthorn Manor all those years ago. She thought often of the ghostly woman and the manor, and she wondered if the guardian spirit had finally found peace. She liked to think that it had, that the darkness had been banished for good, but deep down, she knew that the manor would always hold secrets, mysteries that even she could never fully understand, and that was okay. Some stories were meant to be told, and others were meant to remain untold, whispered only by the shadows in the heart of the manor.
The Forgotten Asylum, Chapter 1. The Invitation. Emma Carter had always been fascinated by the macabre. As a photographer specializing in urban exploration, she had spent years documenting abandoned places, factories, schools, and hospitals, each with its own story to tell. So when she received an anonymous letter inviting her to photograph the long-forgotten Blackwood Asylum, she couldn't resist. The letter was brief but intriguing. Dear Miss Carter, I have followed your work for some time and believe you are the perfect person to document the Blackwood Asylum. The building has been abandoned for over 50 years, but its history is as dark as it is fascinating. I have enclosed a key to the front gate. Please do not share this location with anyone. Sincerely, a friend. Emma packed her gear the next day. Blackwood Asylum was located deep in the woods, far from any town or road. The drive was long and lonely, the trees growing thicker and darker the closer she got. When she finally arrived, the sight of the asylum took her breath away. The building was massive, its Gothic architecture both beautiful and foreboding. The stone walls were cracked and covered in ivy, the windows shattered and dark. The iron gates were rusted and half open, the keyhole matching the key she had been sent. Emma stepped inside, her boots crunching on the broken glass and debris that littered the floor. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, and the silence was oppressive. She set up her camera and began to explore, her excitement growing with every step. Chapter 2. The First Night. As the sun began to set, Emma decided to set up camp in one of the asylum's old offices. The room was small and cluttered, its walls lined with dusty filing cabinets and broken furniture. She lit a few candles to combat the dim light and began to review the photos she had taken. But as the hours passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The asylum seemed to come alive at night, its creaks and groans echoing through the halls like whispers. Emma tried to ignore it, focusing on her work, but the noises grew louder, more insistent. Then came the voices. At first they were faint, like the murmurs of distant conversations, but soon they grew louder, more distinct. Emma strained to listen, but the words were unintelligible, a cacophony of whispers and cries that seemed to come from all around her. She stood, her heart pounding, and scanned the room. There was nothing there.
Hello?
She called out, her voice trembling. The voices stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then from the shadows a figure emerged. It was a man, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and lifeless. He wore a tattered hospital gown, his skin covered in scars and bruises. Emma froze, her breath caught in her throat. "Leave this place," the man said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You do not belong here." Emma's mind raced. She had always believed in rational explanations, but what she was seeing defied all logic. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's lips curled into a grim smile. "I am a prisoner of this asylum. I am the one who keeps the darkness at bay. But even I cannot protect you if you stay." Before Emma could respond, the man vanished, leaving only the faint scent of antiseptic in the air. Emma sat down heavily, her legs trembling. She knew she should leave, but something compelled her to stay. She needed to understand the mystery of Blackwood Asylum.
Chapter 3. The Patient Files.
The next morning, Emma continued her exploration, her encounter with the ghostly man weighing heavily on her mind. As she searched the office, she found a hidden compartment in one of the filing cabinets. Inside was a stack of patient files, their pages yellowed with age. The files told a horrifying story. Blackwood Asylum had been a place of unspeakable cruelty, its patients subjected to brutal experiments and inhumane treatments. Many had died, their bodies buried in unmarked graves on the asylum grounds. But the most chilling entries were those that spoke of something else, a darkness that had taken hold of the asylum, driving its staff and patients to madness. "The shadows are alive," one entry read.
They whisper to us.
filling our minds with horrors we cannot escape. We must seal the asylum or the darkness will consume us all. Emma's blood ran cold. The asylum wasn't just a place of suffering, it was a prison for something far worse, and now it was free. Chapter 4, The Disappearances. It started with the voices. They grew louder, more insistent, filling Emma's mind with whispers of fear and despair. Then it was the shadows. They seemed to move on their own, twisting and writhing like living things. Emma tried to ignore them, focusing on her work, but the darkness was relentless. One night, as she lay in her sleeping bag, she heard a faint scratching sound coming from the walls. She sat up, her heart racing, and listened. The sound grew louder, more frantic, until it seemed to come from all around her. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The scratching stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then from the shadows a hand emerged, its fingers long and skeletal. Emma screamed and scrambled back, her flashlight darting around the room. The hand was gone, but the shadows seemed to close in around her, their whispers growing louder and more menacing. She knew then that she had to leave. But as she packed her gear, she realized that the asylum wouldn't let her go. Chapter 5. The final confrontation. Emma ran through the halls, her flashlight casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The voices were deafening now, their whispers filling her mind with images of terror and despair. She could feel the darkness closing in around her, its cold fingers brushing against her skin. When she reached the front door, she found it locked. The key she had been sent was gone, and the windows were barred. She was trapped. Desperate, she turned to face the darkness. "What do you want from me?" she screamed, her voice echoing through the halls. The shadows seemed to pause, their whispers fading into silence. Then from the darkness the ghostly man emerged, his face filled with sorrow. "We want you to join us," he said, his voice a mournful whisper. "The darkness is hungry, and it will not be denied." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she had only one chance to escape. She reached into her bag and pulled out a flare, its bright light cutting through the shadows like a knife. The darkness recoiled, its whispers turning to screams. Emma lit the flare and threw it into the shadows, the light spreading through the asylum like wildfire. The shadows writhed and twisted, their forms dissolving into nothingness. When the light faded, the asylum was silent. The voices were gone, and the darkness had retreated. Emma knew she had only bought herself time. The darkness would return, and when it did, it would be stronger.
Chapter 6.
The Aftermath. Emma escaped the asylum that night, her mind filled with the horrors she had witnessed. She never spoke of what had happened, but the experience stayed with her, haunting her dreams and filling her days with a sense of unease. Years later, she returned to Blackwood Asylum, her hair streaked with gray. The building was still there, its walls cracked and covered in ivy, but the darkness was gone, its whispers silenced. As she stood at the edge of the asylum grounds, she felt a cold breeze waft through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of antiseptic. And in the distance she heard the faint mournful whisper of the ghostly man waiting for the darkness to rise again.
Title:
The Shadows Beneath Willow Creek. Prologue. The town of Willow Creek. Willow Creek was a town that time had forgotten. Nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills, it was a place of quiet streets, weathered houses, and a sense of unease that hung over everything like a shroud. The townsfolk were a close-knit group, wary of outsiders and protective of their secrets. They spoke in hushed tones of the shadows that lurked beneath the town, of the ancient evil that slept beneath the earth. No one knew when the shadows had first appeared, but they had always been there, a part of the town, a part of its people. They whispered in the night, their voices carried on the wind, and they watched from the darkness, their eyes glowing like embers. For most, the shadows were just a part of life, something to be ignored or appeased. But for those who listened too closely, who ventured too far into the darkness, the shadows were a warning of the evil that lay beneath. Chapter 1. The newcomer Maggie Lane had come to Willow Creek to escape. Her life in the city had become a suffocating mess of broken relationships, dead-end jobs, and a lingering sense of emptiness. When she inherited her grandmother's house in Willow Creek, she saw it as a chance to start over. The house was old, with creaking floorboards and windows that rattled in the wind, but it was hers. For the first time in years, Maggie felt a flicker of hope. The townsfolk were wary of her. They watched her from behind curtains and whispered as she passed. Maggie tried to brush it off, chalking it up to small-town suspicion of outsiders. But there was something in the eyes, a fear that went deeper than mere distrust. On her first night in the house, Maggie sat by the fireplace, a cup of tea in her hands. The wind howled outside and the trees swayed like restless spirits. She told herself it was just the storm, but as the hours passed, she began to hear it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like voices carried on the wind. Chapter 2. The first night, the whispers grew louder as the night deepened. Maggie tried to ignore them, burying herself under blankets and pressing a pillow to her ears. But the voices were insistent, a cacophony of murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a plea, a warning, a call. At dawn, the whispers faded and Maggie emerged from her room, exhausted but determined to put the night behind her. She spent the day unpacking, cleaning, and exploring the house. It was a charming place with its stone walls and wooden beams, but there was something off about it. The air felt heavier inside and the shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. That night, the whispers returned. This time Maggie couldn't ignore them. She followed the sound to the basement where she found an old dust-covered chest. Inside was a collection of journals, their pages filled with her grandmother's handwriting. Maggie sat on the floor reading by the light of a flickering lantern. The journals told a story Maggie could barely comprehend. Her grandmother had written about the shadows, about the whispers, about something that lived beneath the town. She called it the hollowing, a force that fed on fear and regret that twisted the minds of those who listened too closely. Her grandmother had tried to resist it, but in the end, the hollowing had claimed her. Maggie closed the journal, her hands trembling. She told herself it was just the ramblings of a lonely old woman, but deep down she knew better. The whispers were real, and they were calling to her. Chapter 3. The shadows deepened. Over the next few days, Maggie tried to settle into her new life. She explored the town, met a few of the locals, and even started a small garden behind the house. But the whispers never left her. They followed her everywhere, growing louder and more insistent with each passing night. She began to see things, shadows moving in the corners of her vision, figures standing at the edge of the woods. At first she told herself it was just her imagination, but the sightings became harder to dismiss. One night, as she stood at the window, she saw a figure standing in the yard. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness. Maggie froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure raised a hand, beckoning her to come closer. She slammed the curtain shut and locked the door, but the image stayed with her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was watching her, waiting for her. Chapter 4. The Descent. Maggie's nights became a waking nightmare. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and the shadows seemed to close in around her. She stopped sleeping, afraid of what she might see in her dreams. Her once neat house became a mess of scattered journals, empty teacups, and unwashed clothes. She barely recognized herself in the mirror. Her eyes were sunken, her skin pale. One night, unable to bear the whispers any longer, Maggie ventured into the woods. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted like gnarled fingers. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground beneath her feet was soft and yielding. She followed the whispers deeper into the woods, her lantern casting flickering shadows on the trees. She didn't know how long she walked, but eventually she came to a clearing. The center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk twisted and blackened as if burned. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from the tree itself. Maggie stepped closer, her lantern trembling in her hand. As she reached out to touch the tree, the ground beneath her gave way, and she fell into darkness. Chapter 5. The hollowing. Maggie awoke in a cavern, the walls slick with moisture and the air thick with the stench of rot. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deafening silence. She stood, her legs trembling, and looked around. The cavern was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow. In the center of the room stood a figure, the same figure she had seen in her yard. It was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth a gaping void. It spoke, its voice a low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from everywhere. Nowhere at once. "You have come," it said. "You have listened." Maggie tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth. "The hollowing has chosen you," it said. "You will join us." Maggie backed away, but the figure was faster. It reached out, its fingers cold and brittle, and touched her forehead. She felt a surge of icy pain, and then everything went black. Chapter 6. The Awakening. When Maggie awoke, she was back in her house. The sun was shining through the windows and the whispers were gone. For a moment she thought it had all been a dream, but as she stood she noticed something was different. The shadows seemed darker, the air heavier, and when she looked in the mirror she saw that her eyes were no longer her own, they were hollow, empty. The hollowing had claimed her. Epilogue. The shadows beneath Willow Creek. The townsfolk of Willow Creek never saw Maggie again. Her house stood empty, its windows dark and its door locked.
But sometimes on quiet nights they would hear whispers coming from the woods, and they would see shadows moving among the trees. And deep within the earth the hollowing continued to grow, its voice carried on the wind, calling to those who would listen.
Title: The Hollow Man, Chapter 1. The reflection. Elliot Graves had always felt like an outsider. He moved through life like a ghost, unnoticed and unremembered. People's eyes slid past him in crowds, and even his co-workers struggled to recall his name. He told himself it didn't matter, that he preferred the anonymity, but deep down he knew something was wrong. One night, as he stood in front of the bathroom mirror, he noticed something strange. His reflection didn't move when he did. It stared back at him, its eyes hollow and empty, its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. Elliot stumbled back, his heart pounding, but when he looked again, the reflection was normal. He told himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the light, but the image stayed with him, lingering in the back of his mind like a shadow. Chapter 2. The Whisper. The next day, Elliot began to hear it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. It was soft at first, barely audible over the noise of the city, but as the days passed it grew louder, more insistent. The whisper spoke in a language Elliot didn't understand, its words guttural and alien, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a plea, a warning, a call. He tried to ignore it, to convince himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but the whisper followed him everywhere, growing louder with each passing day. Chapter 3. The Stranger. One night as Elliot walked home from work, he saw a man standing under a street lamp. The man was tall and gaunt, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were hollow, his mouth a thin, cruel line. He wore a tattered coat, its fabric frayed and stained. Elliot tried to walk past him, but the man stepped into his path. "You hear it, don't you?" the man said, his voice low and rasping. The whisper. Elliot froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who are you?" he asked. The man smiled, his teeth yellow and broken. "I'm like you," he said, hollow. Before Elliot could respond, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Chapter 4. The Dream. That night Elliot had a dream. He stood in a vast, endless void, surrounded by swirling shadows and faint, flickering lights. The air was thick, suffocating, and the ground beneath him felt soft and yielding. In the distance he saw a figure, a man with hollow eyes and a cruel smile. The figure beckoned to him, its movements unnaturally smooth. Elliot tried to run, but the void seemed to stretch on forever, its edges lost in darkness. The figure spoke, its voice a low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You are hollow," it said. "You belong to us." Elliot woke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The whisper was louder now, more insistent. He knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Chapter 5. The Truth. Elliot spent the next few days searching for answers. He scoured the internet, visited libraries, and even sought out the stranger he had met under the street lamp. But the man was gone, leaving no trace behind. Finally, Elliot found what he was looking for, a book, its pages filled with strange symbols and cryptic text. The book spoke of the hollow men, beings who existed between worlds, neither alive nor dead. They were drawn to those who felt empty, who had lost their way, and once they claimed you, there was no escape. Elliot's hands trembled as he read the final passage. The hollow men are always watching, always waiting. They feed on the emptiness within, growing stronger with each soul they claim. To resist them is to face the void, to confront the darkness within yourself, but to succumb is to become one of them, to lose yourself forever. Chapter 6. The Choice. Elliot knew what he had to do. He couldn't let the hollow men claim him, couldn't let them feed on his emptiness. He had to confront the void, to face the darkness within himself. That night he stood in front of the mirror, his reflection staring back at him with hollow eyes. The whisper was deafening now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Elliot took a deep breath and stepped into the mirror. Chapter 7. The Void. The void was vast and endless, its edges lost in darkness. Elliot felt a presence nearby, something vast and ancient, something that had been waiting for him. The presence spoke, its voice a low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You have come," it said. "You have faced the void." Elliot tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The presence stepped closer, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. "You are hollow," it said. "You belong to us." Elliot backed away, but the presence was faster. It reached out, its formless hand brushing against his chest. He felt a surge of icy pain, and then everything went black. Epilogue. The Hollow Man. When Elliot woke, he was back in his apartment. The whisper was gone, the mirror normal. But he felt different, hollow, empty, as if something had been taken from him. He looked in the mirror and saw his reflection staring back at him, its eyes hollow and empty, its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. The Hollow Man had claimed him. Title: The Thing Under the Bed. Chapter 1. The new house. Emily had always been afraid of the dark. Even at 8 years old, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in the shadows, waiting to grab her if she let her guard down. Her parents told her it was just her imagination, that there was nothing to be afraid of, but Emily knew better. When her family moved into the old Victorian house on the edge of town, Emily's fears only grew worse. The house was massive, with creaky floorboards, drafty windows, and shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should. Her room was on the second floor, at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. It was a beautiful room, with a high ceiling, a large window, and a bed that was far too big for her. But from the moment she stepped inside, Emily felt like she wasn't alone. Chapter 2. The First Night. The first night in the new house was the worst. Emily lay in bed, her blankets pulled up to her chin, her eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting and twisting in the dim light of the moon. She told herself it was just her imagination, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. And then she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound like scratching coming from under the bed. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She told herself it was just the house settling, or maybe a mouse, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. She leaned over the edge of the bed and peered into the darkness. At first she saw nothing, but then just as she was about to pull back, she saw it, a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her. Emily screamed and scrambled out of bed, running to her parents' room. They calmed her down, telling her it was just a bad dream, but Emily knew what she had seen. Chapter 3. The Thing Under the Bed. The next night, Emily tried to be brave. She told herself there was nothing under the bed, that it was just her imagination. But as she lay in bed, the scratching returned, louder this time. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her flashlight and shone it under the bed. The beam of light revealed nothing but dust and a few forgotten toys. Emily let out a sigh of relief and climbed back into bed. But as she lay there, she felt something cold and wet brush against her ankle. She jerked her leg back, her heart racing. She shone the flashlight under the bed again, but there was nothing there. Chapter 4. The Truth. The next day, Emily decided to investigate. She waited until her parents were busy, then crept back into her room. She knelt beside the bed and peered underneath, her flashlight in hand. This time she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a small hidden compartment in the floor. Her hands trembled as she pulled it open, revealing a stack of old yellowed papers. The papers were covered in childish handwriting, their words shaky and uneven. They told a story Emily could barely comprehend. A story about a boy who had lived in the house long ago, a boy who had been afraid of the dark. The boy had written about the thing under the bed, about how it had whispered to him in the night, about how it had tried to pull him into the darkness. He had tried to tell his parents, but they hadn't believed him. And then one night, the boy had disappeared. Emily's hands trembled as she read the final entry. It's coming for me, I can feel it. It's under the bed, waiting. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. Please, if anyone finds this, don't let it get you too. Chapter 5. The Final Night. That night, Emily knew she couldn't stay in her room. She tried to tell her parents, but they brushed her off, telling her it was just her imagination. Desperate, she decided to sleep on the couch in the living room, but as she lay there she heard it, the scratching, louder than ever. She sat up, her heart pounding, and saw something moving in the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, its eyes glowing like embers. It reached out, its fingers long and bony, and whispered her name. Emily screamed and ran to her parents' room, but the door was locked. She pounded on the door, begging them to let her in, but there was no answer. She turned, her back pressed against the door, and saw the thing standing in the hallway. It smiled, its mouth stretching too wide, and reached for her. Epilogue. The empty room. The next morning, Emily's parents found her room empty. The bed was neatly made, the toys arranged just so, but Emily was gone. They searched the house, the neighborhood, the town,
but there was no trace of her. The police said she must have run away, but her parents knew better. They had heard the scratching, the whispers, the screams, but they had ignored them, just like they had ignored Emily. And now, as they sat in the empty house, they heard it, the faint, almost imperceptible sound of scratching coming from under the bed.
Title: The Hollow Man, Chapter 1. The reflection. Elliot Graves had always felt like an outsider. He moved through life like a ghost, unnoticed and unremembered. People's eyes slid past him in crowds, and even his co-workers struggled to recall his name. He told himself it didn't matter, that he preferred the anonymity, but deep down he knew something was wrong. One night, as he stood in front of the bathroom mirror, he noticed something strange. His reflection didn't move when he did. It stared back at him, its eyes hollow and empty, its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. Elliot stumbled back, his heart pounding, but when he looked again, the reflection was normal. He told himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the light, but the image stayed with him, lingering in the back of his mind like a shadow. Chapter 2. The Whisper. The next day, Elliot began to hear it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper like a voice carried on the wind. It was soft at first, barely audible over the noise of the city, but as the days passed it grew louder, more insistent. The whisper spoke in a language Elliot didn't understand, its words guttural and alien, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a plea, a warning, a call. He tried to ignore it, to convince himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but the whisper followed him everywhere, growing louder with each passing day. Chapter 3. The Stranger. One night, as Elliot walked home from work, he saw a man standing under a street lamp. The man was tall and gaunt, his face pale and drawn, his eyes were hollow, his mouth a thin, cruel line. He wore a tattered coat, its fabric frayed and stained. Elliot tried to walk past him, but the man stepped into his path. "You hear it, don't you?" the man said, his voice low and rasping. The whisper. Elliot froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who are you?" he asked. The man smiled, his teeth yellow and broken. "I'm like you," he said, hollow. Before Elliot could respond, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Chapter 4. The Dream. That night, Elliot had a dream. He stood in a vast, endless void, surrounded by swirling shadows and faint, flickering lights. The air was thick, suffocating, and the ground beneath him felt soft and yielding. In the distance he saw a figure, a man with hollow eyes and a cruel smile. The figure beckoned to him, its movements unnaturally smooth. Elliot tried to run, but the void seemed to stretch on forever, its edges lost in darkness. The figure spoke, its voice a low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You are hollow," it said. "You belong to us." Elliot woke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The whisper was louder now, more insistent. He knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Chapter 5. The Truth. Elliot spent the next few days searching for answers. He scoured the internet, visited libraries, and even sought out the stranger he had met under the street lamp. But the man was gone, leaving no trace behind. Finally, Elliot found what he was looking for, a book, its pages filled with strange symbols and cryptic text. The book spoke of the hollow men, beings who existed between worlds, neither alive nor dead. They were drawn to those who felt empty, who had lost their way, and once they claimed you, there was no escape. Elliot's hands trembled as he read the final passage. The hollow men are always watching, always waiting. They feed on the emptiness within, growing stronger with each soul they claim. To resist them is to face the void, to confront the darkness within yourself, but to succumb is to become one of them, to lose yourself forever. Chapter 6. The Choice. Elliot knew what he had to do. He couldn't let the hollow men claim him, couldn't let them feed on his emptiness. He had to confront the void, to face the darkness within himself. That night, he stood in front of the mirror, his reflection staring back at him with hollow eyes. The whisper was deafening now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Elliot took a deep breath and stepped into the mirror. Chapter 7. The Void. The void was vast and endless, its edges lost in darkness. Elliot felt a presence nearby, something vast and ancient, something that had been waiting for him. The presence spoke, its voice a low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Once, you have come," it said. "You have faced the void." Elliot tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The presence stepped closer, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. "You are hollow," it said. "You belong to us." Elliot backed away, but the presence was faster. It reached out, its formless hand brushing against his chest. He felt a surge of icy pain, and then everything went black. Epilogue. The Hollow Man. When Elliot woke, he was back in his apartment. The whisper was gone, the mirror worked, but he felt different, hollow, empty, as if something had been taken from him. He looked in the mirror and saw his reflection staring back at him, its eyes hollow and empty, its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. The Hollow Men had claimed him. Title: The Thing Under the Bed. Chapter 1. The New House. Emily had always been afraid of the dark. Even at 8 years old, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in the shadows waiting to grab her. She let her guard down. Her parents told her it was just her imagination, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But Emily knew better. When her family moved into the old Victorian house on the edge of town, Emily's fears only grew worse. The house was massive, with creaky floorboards, drafty windows and shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should. Her room was on the second floor, at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. It was a beautiful room, with a high ceiling, a large window, and a bed that was far too big for her. But from the moment she stepped inside, Emily felt like she wasn't alone. Chapter 2. The First Night. The first night, the first night, the first night in the new house was the worst. Emily lay in bed, her blankets pulled up to her chin, her eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting and twisting in the dim light of the moon. She told herself it was just her imagination, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. And then she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like scratching coming from under the bed. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She told herself it was just the house settling, or maybe a mouse, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. She leaned over the edge of the bed and peered into the darkness. At first she saw nothing, but then just as she was about to pull back, she saw it, a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her. Emily screamed and scrambled out of bed, running to her parents' room. They calmed her down, telling her it was just a bad dream, but Emily knew what she had seen. Chapter 3. The Thing Under the Bed. The next night, Emily tried to be brave. She told herself there was nothing under the bed, that it was just her imagination. But as she lay in bed, a scratching returned, louder this time. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her flashlight and shone it under the bed. The beam of light revealed nothing but dust and a few forgotten toys. Emily let out a sigh of relief and climbed back into bed. But as she lay there, she felt something cold and wet brush against her ankle. She jerked her leg back, her heart racing. She shone the flashlight under the bed again, but there was nothing there. Chapter 4. The Truth. The next day, Emily decided to investigate. She waited until her parents were busy, then crept back into her room. She knelt beside the bed and peered underneath, her flashlight in hand. This time, she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a small hidden compartment in the floor. Her hands trembled as she pulled it open, revealing a stack of old yellowed papers. The papers were covered in childish handwriting, their words shaky and uneven. They told a story Emily could barely comprehend. A story about a boy who had lived in the house long ago, a boy who had been afraid of the dark. The boy had written about the thing under the bed, about how it had whispered to him in the night, about how it had tried to pull him into the darkness. He had tried to tell his parents, but they hadn't believed him. And then, one night, the boy had disappeared. Emily's hands trembled as she read the final entry. "It's coming for me. I can feel it. It's under the bed. Waiting. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. Please, if anyone finds this, don't let it get you too." Chapter 5. The Final Night. That night, Emily knew she couldn't stay in her room. She tried to tell her parents, but they brushed her off, telling her it was just her imagination. Desperate, she decided to sleep on the couch in the living room, but as she lay there she heard it, the scratching, louder than ever. She sat up, her heart pounding, and saw something moving in the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, its eyes glowing like embers. It reached out, its fingers long and bony, and whispered her name. Emily screamed and ran to her parents' room, but the door was locked. She pounded on the door, begging them to let her in. But there was no answer. She turned, her back pressed against the door, and saw the thing standing in the hallway. It smiled, its mouth stretching too wide, and reached for her. Epilogue. The Empty Room. The next morning, Emily's parents found her room empty. The bed was neatly made, the toys arranged just so, but Emily was gone. They searched the house, the neighborhood, the town, but there was no trace of her. The police said she must have run away, but her parents knew better. They had heard the scratching, the whispers, the screams, but they had ignored them just like they had ignored Emily. And now, as they sat in the empty house, they heard it, the faint, almost imperceptible sound of scratching coming from under the bed. Title: The Forgotten Portrait. Chapter 1. The Auction. Eleanor Blake had always been drawn to the macabre. As an art historian, she specialized in forgotten works of the 19th century, pieces that had been lost to time and neglect. So when she heard about the auction of the Blackwood estate, she knew she had to attend. The Blackwood family had been wealthy and influential, but their name had been tainted by scandal and tragedy. Their estate, a sprawling mansion on the edge of town, had been abandoned for decades. The auction was a chance to own a piece of that history, and Eleanor was determined to find something special. As she wandered through the dusty rooms of the mansion, her eyes fell on a portrait tucked away in a corner. It was a painting of a young woman, her face pale and hauntingly beautiful. Her eyes seemed to follow Eleanor as she moved, and there was something about the painting that sent a shiver down her spine. Eleanor knew she had to have it. Chapter 2. The portrait. The portrait arrived at Eleanor's apartment a week later. She hung it above the fireplace, where it seemed to dominate the room. The woman's eyes followed her wherever she went, and Eleanor found herself drawn to the painting, spending hours staring at it, trying to decipher its secrets. The woman in the portrait was dressed in a flowing black gown, her hands clasped in front of her. Her expression was serene, but there was something in her eyes, a sadness, a longing, a hint of something darker. Eleanor began to research the painting, but there was no record of it in any of the Blackwood family archives. It was as if the portrait had been erased from history. Chapter 3. The Whispers. The first night after the portrait arrived, Eleanor heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. It was soft at first, barely audible over the noise of the city, but as the days passed it grew louder, more insistent. The whisper spoke in a language Eleanor didn't understand, its words guttural and alien, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a plea, a warning, a call. She tried to ignore it, to convince herself it was just her imagination, but the whisper followed her everywhere, growing louder with each passing day. Chapter 4. The Stranger. One night, as Eleanor worked late in her study, she saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, tall and gaunt, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth a thin, cruel line. She wore a flowing black gown, its fabric frayed and stained. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who are you?" she asked. The woman smiled, her teeth yellow and broken. "I am the one in the portrait," she said, "and you have brought me back." Before Eleanor could respond, the woman turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Chapter 5. The Dream. That night, Eleanor had a dream. She stood in a vast, endless void, surrounded by swirling shadows and faint, flickering lights. The air was thick, suffocating, and the ground beneath her felt soft and yielding. In the distance she saw a figure, a woman with hollow eyes and a cruel smile. The figure beckoned to her, its movements unnaturally smooth. Eleanor tried to run, but the void seemed to stretch on forever, its edges lost in darkness. The figure spoke, its voice a low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You have brought me back," it said. "You belong to me now." Eleanor woke in a cold sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. The whisper was louder now, more insistent. She knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. Chapter 6. The Truth. Eleanor spent the next few days searching for answers. She scoured the internet, visited libraries, and even sought out the stranger she had met in her study. But the woman was gone, leaving no trace behind. Finally, Eleanor found what she was looking for, a book, its pages filled with strange symbols and cryptic text. The book spoke of the woman in the portrait, a woman who had been cursed to live forever, trapped in the painting. She fed on the souls of those who owned the portrait, growing stronger with each one she claimed. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the final passage. The woman in the portrait is always watching, always waiting. She feeds on the souls of the living, growing stronger with each one she claims. To resist her is to face the void, to confront the darkness within yourself, but to succumb is to lose yourself forever. Chapter 7.
The choice. Eleanor knew what she had to do. She couldn't let the woman in the portrait claim her. Couldn't let her feed on her soul. She had to confront the void, to face the darkness within herself. That night, she stood in front of the portrait, the woman's eyes staring back at her with hollow eyes. The whisper was deafening now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Eleanor took a deep breath and stepped into the painting. Chapter 8. The Void. The void was vast and endless, its edges lost in darkness. Eleanor felt a presence nearby, something vast and ancient, something that had been waiting for her. The presence spoke, its voice a low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. You have come, it said. You have faced the void. Eleanor tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The presence stepped closer, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. You belong to me now, it said. You are mine. Eleanor backed away, but the presence was faster. It reached out, its formless hand brushing against her chest. She felt a surge of icy pain, and then everything went black. Epilogue. The Forgotten Portrait. When Eleanor woke, she was back in her apartment. The whisper was gone, the portrait normal, but she felt different. Hollow, empty, as if something had been taken from her. She looked at the portrait, and saw the woman staring back at her, her eyes hollow and empty, her mouth twisted into a cruel smile. The woman in the portrait had claimed her. Chapter 1. The Arrival. Thomas Reed had always been drawn to the sea. As a child, he would spend hours staring at the waves, imagining the adventures that lay beyond the horizon. So when he was offered the job of lighthouse keeper on the remote island of Blo, he didn't hesitate. The island was small and barren, with nothing but the lighthouse and a small cottage for company. The previous keeper had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only a cryptic note. Beware the light. Thomas dismissed the note as the ramblings of a lonely old man, but as he stepped off the boat and onto the island, he felt a chill run down his spine. The air thick with the scent of salt and decay, and the lighthouse loomed over him like a sentinel. Chapter 2. The first night. The first night on the island was the worst. Thomas lay in bed, the wind howling outside, the waves crashing against the rocks. The lighthouse beam swept across the room, casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. And then he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like scratching coming from the lighthouse. Thomas froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He told himself it was just the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. He grabbed his flashlight and made his way to the lighthouse, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The door creaked open, revealing a spiral staircase that seemed to stretch on forever. Thomas climbed the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. At the top he found the source of the sound, a large rusted mechanism, its gears grinding against each other. He tried to fix it, but the mechanism was too old, too broken. As he turned to leave, he saw something out of the corner of his eye, a figure, tall and gaunt, standing in the shadows. Thomas shone his flashlight on the figure, but there was nothing there. Chapter 3. The Whisper. The next night, the scratching returned louder this time. Thomas tried to ignore it, but the sound was impossible to block out. He climbed the stairs again, his flashlight in hand, but the mechanism was silent. As he stood there, he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. It was soft at first, barely audible over the noise of the waves, but as the days passed it grew louder, more insistent. The whisper spoke in a language Thomas didn't understand, its words guttural and alien, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a plea, a warning, a call. He tried to ignore it, to convince himself it was just his imagination, but the whisper followed him everywhere, growing louder with each passing day. Chapter 4. The Stranger. One night, as Thomas worked in the lighthouse, he saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face pale and drawn, his eyes were hollow, his mouth a thin, cruel line. He wore a tattered coat, its fabric frayed and stained. Thomas froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who are you?" he asked. The man smiled, his teeth yellow and broken. "I am the one who came before you," he said, "and I am the one who will come after." Before Thomas could respond, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Chapter 5. The Dream. That night, Thomas had a dream. He stood in a vast, endless void, surrounded by swirling shadows and faint flickering lights. The air was thick, suffocating, and the ground beneath him felt soft and yielding. In the distance he saw a figure, a man with hollow eyes and a cruel smile. The figure beckoned to him, its movements unnaturally smooth. Thomas tried to run, but the void seemed to stretch on forever, its edges lost in darkness. The figure spoke, its voice a low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You have come," it said. "You have faced the void." Thomas woke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The whisper was louder now, more insistent. He knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Chapter 6. The Truth. Thomas spent the next few days searching for answers. He scoured the lighthouse, the cottage, and even the island itself, but there was no trace of the man he had seen, no explanation for the whisper. Finally, he found what he was looking for, a book, its pages filled with strange symbols and cryptic text. The book spoke of the lighthouse, of the light that had been cursed to burn forever, of the souls it had claimed over the years. Thomas's hands trembled as he read the final passage. The light is always watching, always waiting. It feeds on the souls of the living, growing stronger with each one it claims. To resist it is to face the void, to confront the darkness within yourself, but to succumb is to lose yourself forever. Chapter 7. The Choice. Thomas knew what he had to do. He couldn't let the light claim him, couldn't let it feed on his soul. He had to confront the void, to face the darkness within himself. That night, he stood in the lighthouse, the beam of light sweeping across the room. The whisper was deafening now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Thomas took a deep breath and stepped into the light. Chapter 8. The Void. The void was vast and endless, its edges lost in darkness. Thomas felt a presence nearby, something vast and ancient, something that had been waiting for him. The presence spoke, its voice a low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from everywhere. "You have come," it said. "You have faced the void." Thomas tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The presence stepped closer, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. "You belong to me now," it said. "You are mine." Thomas backed away, but the presence was faster. It reached out, its formless hand brushing against his chest. He felt a surge of icy pain, and then everything went black. Epilogue. The Lighthouse Keeper's Secret. When Thomas woke, he was back in the lighthouse. The whisper was gone, the light normal, but he felt different. Hollow, empty, as if something had been taken from him. He looked at the light and saw the beam sweeping across the room, casting long shifting shadows on the walls. The light had claimed him.